And we are live. Welcome everybody to our fourth consecutive anti-spy bill live stream event. We have just had such amazing feedback about the last three events, and I'm so pleased to be continuing it today with a good friend of mine, an extremely accomplished anti-war activist, David Swanson. David he wears so many hats that I can barely list them all. He's an author of several incredible anti-war books and even a children's book. He is a radio show host and a journalist, a public speaker, an organizer, a community organizer. He is the director of worldbeyondwar.org. He is the campaign coordinator for Roots Action, which is involved in a huge number of incredibly important activism campaigns. And he is an all-round amazing person. He is here to speak to us. I'm going to give him 20 minutes to tell us his story about how he became an anti-war activist and what he's been working on ever since. Take it away, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Suzie. Let me know if anybody can't hear me okay or if I'm too far off topic or over time, but I don't know if I can do 20 minutes just on how I got to be an activist. I may have to get into what the activism is, but, I'm speaking to you from a little town in Virginia in the United States called Charlottesville that has been in the news lately as a place where racists hold rallies, neo-Nazis, fascists, the Ku Klux Klan hold rallies. And almost all of these people are from outside this town, outside this state, but they come here because there's a war statue that the city council in Charlottesville has voted to take down. And the reason I mention this, it's not anything to do with its being a war statue that puts it in the news or has people rallying to defend it or rallying against it. War in the United States has become so normalized that everybody from left to right is simply satisfied with war. The statue has its racist defenders and its anti-racist opponents. Yet, the reason it's still standing, although now two of the Confederate War generals on horses statues in the middle of Charlottesville now have black tarps of shame over them, but they're still standing, is because there's a law in this state, as in some other states in the United States, that says thou shalt not take down any war statues. Racist or otherwise, as if you can have a non-racist war statue. And, and this is, why I got involved in opposing war in the ways that I'm trying to. And I would object to Suzie's generous description as accomplished, because we haven't accomplished ending war. But war has been so normalized in the United States that people don't even see it. When I grew up in Northern Virginia, in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and I was taught, like virtually every other kid on the planet, that it's better not to fight or to, try to use violence to solve problems. Yet I could see all around me that our biggest enterprise as a society, as a culture, was in organized mass killing. And mass killing has been so accepted in the United States in ways that are true in some cases in Israel and other countries around the world, but increasingly in the United States, everywhere you go, there are war flags and war songs and thank yous and discounts for members of the military and celebrations of the military. This is something that matters because the United States is not just any other country. It's a country that spends as much on wars as all the other countries put together, that, has at least 95% of the military bases on Earth that are on foreign territory are U.S. bases on foreign territory. Nobody else, does this. Nobody has military bases here in the United States for their country. And so I've become part, as Suzie mentioned, I've become part of this campaign called World Beyond War, where the website is at worldbeyondwar.org, where we're trying through education about past wars, about the world, about the current state of affairs, and nonviolent activism to move us away from this total acceptance of war, which, is now increasing. And we have debates in U.S. politics over whether to have a bigger government or a smaller government, and a evil racist government or a good non-racist government, and it's all fraudulent. We have a racist president who replaced a supposedly non-racist president who was busy bombing several countries at a time, none of which were identified as being predominantly white countries. And we have a president who's proposed to move another $50 billion, several percent of U.S. government spending from everything almost other than the military into the military, has proposed the exact same size budget as the previous year, but moving money increasingly to the military, which is already the majority of the money that the U.S. Congress decides what to do with every year is already in militarism. He wants more. And the opposition, is out there denouncing the cuts to the things they care about and avoiding mentioning the military, because that's just not done. You don't want to mention that the military costs money or be accused of opposing it. It's become so normalized and taboo to oppose. So we're trying to organize a global campaign against war, and have had some success and seen some advantages in it already. We, relevant maybe to this call, we have just lined up a volunteer coordinator for World Beyond War in New Zealand. And if you go to worldbeyondwar.org/New Zealand, you can get in touch with her and see what we're planning to do in that part of the world. But I think, relevant to this issue of spying, which I claim no particular expertise on, war is, sorry, it's like 4 a.m. here. War is, as I see it, the overlooked reason why governments are able to claim powers to spy at all. The actual motivations for government surveillance often include, favors to corporations, suppression of opposition, of activism. In the case of the United States, opportunities to dominate the globe and influence with carrots and sticks other nations' delegations to the United Nations, which are spied on by the US government, and so forth. But the rationale, the public justification, is principally war. If there were not foreign enemies, if there were not understood to be foreign enemies seeking to destroy us all, the US government, at least, would not get very far at all with arguments based on domestic crime or arguments subtly backed by racism. Without the war justification for spying, we wouldn't have public defense of unconstitutional and in violation of human rights spying programs in the United States, and we wouldn't have the United States engaged in surveillance around the world and in collaboration with other governments, suppressing activism, advancing corporate agendas, without that idea that there are and must be enemies, foreign enemies, military enemies, which are, understood as being here among us as well in the United States now, with President Trump increasing now the programs that give the war weapons to the domestic police, allowing suppression of activism, but also allowing the purchase of more weapons for the war profiteers. And so when we make a case against war at World Beyond War, part of it is that war is clearly the primary way in which we lose our civil liberties, including the rights not to be searched and seized and spied on. And with every war, we have fewer rights to speak and assemble, unless we are, racists and Nazis coming to Charlottesville. Then you can speak and assemble and bring your semi-automatic weapons, no problems. But, for opponents of war to speak and assemble, we're not allowed to have rallies with, posters on sticks. We have to have harmless hollow cardboard tubes to hold up our posters, because nonviolent activists might harm someone. This is, this sort of suppression of rights. And, Donald Trump is expanding the power of the police to seize cash and property without justification, without arrest, without conviction, and has just pardoned a sheriff convicted of racist, sadistic abuses and so forth. This all comes back to war and the way that war advances the understanding that we should lose our rights, that we should give up our rights because there's something more important, and the way war promotes racism and bigotry that couldn't be done without war. We also we can touch on any of these topics, and yes, they all have to do with why I got into activism. But we also make the case that war is the top destroyer of our natural environment, and in fact, the U.S. military ranks fairly high in a list of countries in consumption of petroleum and pollution of the skies and earth and water. Most countries spend far less on militarism and consume less petroleum and do less environmental damage as an entire nation than does the U.S. military. And it's, there are Superfund sites in the United States. These are environmental disaster sites that have been identified by the US government, which is saying quite a lot, as needing massive cleanup. 69% of them are produced by the US military. The damage the US military does just within the United States, much less in islands around the world, it's totally destroyed and used for bombing practice and so forth, is incredible. So we have a conference coming up in September that will be live streamed, and people are planning events around the world to watch the live stream, but it'll be in Washington, D.C., bringing together environmental groups and anti-war groups. Because as with civil liberties groups that go after the spying and the torture and the lawless imprisonment and so forth, but won't mention military spending or war, from a certain perspective, are going after symptoms, but won't touch the disease. Major environmental groups also will not mention the top destroyer of the environment around. Well, of course, ordinary environmentalists are generally willing to do so. And so across numerous issues, immigration / refugee rights, financial issues, the money, small fractions of what goes into the U.S. military / security / surveillance operations could end starvation on Earth and numerous diseases and the lack of clean drinking water and the use of fossil fuels. This is really where the money is going. And we actually, to an increasing, although limited extent, have a politics in the United States willing to go after billionaires, willing to mention the concentration of wealth. And yet you could tax all the money away from all the billionaires once and have what you could take away from the military each and every year after year after year. And that's unmentionable in corporate media in the United States. So, you know, this is the case that we're trying to make against war. This is what got me involved in activism and eventually into anti-war activism, because there's no campaigns out there recruiting anti-war activists other than to a very limited extent, groups like World Beyond War and other good peace groups, whereas there's billions of dollars put into recruiting new members of the military. So I had to find my way over a period of many years in getting into domestic activism and finally finding my way to anti-war activism. You know, the reason for me is simple morality, is simply that this is the most destructive institution we've got, that is directly killing the greatest number of people and indirectly killing the greatest number of people, again, through the diversion of resources that could be being used to save people. And as I've gotten into it, I've, you know, come to study to a greater extent the ways that people try to justify it with the excuse that there might be a just war, a good war someday. You know, this is, you know, medieval doctrine that has, you know, lingered beyond any other, you know, centuries longer than any other aspect of the worldview of these, you know, medieval monks who came up with it. But this case that there could be a just war someday is absolutely ludicrous, you know, because the United States has been through the past 75 years since the last World War, bombing over 30 countries, engaging in increasingly permanent warfare, and none of the wars remotely meeting the criteria for a just war. In fact, most of the criteria for a just war being impossible to meet, others being incoherent, others being amoral, and all of the rest being, you know, unmeasurable, non-empirical, simply rhetorical. And if you could have a war that met all the criteria for a just war, it would have to outweigh all of the blatantly unjust wars that are created by the military spending preparing for that just war. And it would have to outweigh the murderous diversion of resources away from human and environmental needs into the war industry. So, you know, there was a robber baron in a previous era of concentrated wealth in the United States named Andrew Carnegie, who had set up something called the Carnegie Peace Endowment, which, like any other, you know, group in the United States, now works on anything but peace. But he gave the instructions to the board: you need to work on eliminating war and then have a board meeting, figure out the second most evil thing on earth and work on eliminating that. That, I think, is a basic understanding of morality, you know. And so I always say, you know, why are you a peace activist? I always ask, why are you not? What, you know, give me an argument for a decent human life that doesn't work on ending the most evil things we've got and replacing them with something good. So, you know, so that's what I'm working on. And there are various projects now, that we can talk about, the treaty to ban the possession of nuclear weapons being a wonderful global project, the closing of military bases, the divestment from war profiteers, the educational project about what war is and how to end it. These are things that we're much stronger at if we work globally, if we work across borders. And of course, in the United States, I'm also involved in, you know, various other projects that are related, including a growing effort to impeach and remove our current president. So we can talk about about that. If you pick up the New York Times this morning, you'll see an opinion piece about the, remarkably and somewhat misguidedly, predictably enough, but it's the New York Times, but remarkably outlining some of the benefits of a treaty that banned war in 1928 called the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which I wrote a book about some years back, and which a couple of law professors at Yale University have now written a lengthy book about and put this op-ed in this morning's New York Times. But I'd be very interested to know what something like the Kellogg-Briand Pact is thought of in New Zealand and elsewhere around the world, as far as you're aware of, if it's thought of at all. And I think it's, worth mentioning, because here, when you even manage to get something into mainstream communications in the United States about a treaty that bans wars, and to thoroughly investigate over several years, as these professors and his whole crew of graduate students, did, all the benefits, the ending of the conquest of territory as something acceptable, and generally the ending of the conquest of territory, and all these dramatic changes in international law that happened in 1928 because of this treaty that's generally mocked by the few people who've ever heard of it. Even then, you get this exceptionalist view that war is something that's done by anyone other than the United States. And the big dangers to the new era of peace are the vicious Russian seizure of Crimea and the Chinese and North Korean and Iranian belligerents and so forth. That it's a very, very U.S. view. Anyway, I think I've probably hit 20 minutes or more, so we might be better off if you all direct the conversation the ways you want it to go.
I could listen to you talk for hours quite happily, to be honest with you, David. It's remarkable. Having read some of your books, it's just incredible the amount of knowledge that is inside your head. And it's the type of knowledge that is not easily accessible to the general public unless they happen across it. It is not taught to us in school, which is interesting. You talk about the education program that you're trying to set up, because kids, unless they hear it from their parents, kids are not only not taught about why we should be against war, but they are almost recruited into supporting war. So we've seen a case recently in New Zealand where school kids are having the military come into the schools and are giving them arms training and weapons training and teaching them to fire on command. And this has caused, quite a bit of outrage amongst some parents, though there are also other parents who are in support of it and think it's a good idea. But it just goes to show that our youth are being targeted with pro-war propaganda all of the time, be it on TV or in school, or when they're taught to cut articles out of a newspaper and bring it to school and talk about it for news. Often there is tacit approval of war embedded in those articles that they are sharing and being taught that this is credible information. So that effort to try to educate kids otherwise is extremely important. And I have a list of questions here that I want to ask you and things I want to get your opinion on, but I also just want to plug your children's book a little bit, because not many people realize this, but David actually sent my son, my 6-year-old son, a book that he had written called Tube World. And my son was extremely excited to read a chapter of the book every night. And the concept of Tube World is that there are these children who discover that they're through swimming pools, public swimming pools, they can go through the drain system and pop out at various locations all around the world. And so these children get to visit these different countries and learn about different cultures and about the issues that are facing those cultures and those people, be it environmental or be it war or be it social or poverty. It's all interrelated. And through this children's book, Tube World, our kids are able to learn in a really safe and positive and educational way about what is really happening to our planet and about the diverse cultures and peoples that exist on the planet. And the book teaches them to see things from different perspectives, see it from the perspective of kids in Afghanistan or kids in Italy or kids in the Maldives facing climate change. And it's really the most remarkable children's book that I've ever read in my life, without a doubt. And so I assume it's available online. If you guys have kids, I strongly recommend that you find a way to get your hands on a copy of that book by David, because there is nothing like it that I've ever seen or read, and it really is amazing. Okay, so moving along, having plugged Tube World.
Thank you.
I would like to talk with you about the inherent racism in war. So today we have had people who are associated with the two major parties in New Zealand, which are the equivalent of the Democrats and Republicans, accusing the Internet Party of racism. Yet we stand firmly against war, against spying and the privatization of war and spying, and the military-industrial complex as a whole. Whereas both of the parties accusing us of racism are up to their necks in war and war profiteering. So I'm wondering, can you tell us more about the ways that racism is perpetuated in and integral to modern warfare and propping up the narratives surrounding it?
Yes, and thank you for hyping my books, and I think you can get them anywhere online or real world stores, or go to davidswanson.org. If you have to, go to CIA and military profiteer and monopolist Amazon.com and get it there. But I think the United States, maybe, I know that New Zealand continually surprises me by outdoing the United States government in various horrors, but I think the United States may be ahead in the militarization of youth. I mean, there is one nation on earth that has not joined the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it's the United States. And it's not just because the United States wants the ability to put children in prison for life. It's because the United States wants the ability to recruit children into the military, and uses the military to recruit, children, 11, 12-year-old children through video games, through movies, through sending generals into schools. And it's become so normalized that you see stories pop up once in a while when someone objects to things like kindergarten teachers asking the kids which branch of the military would it be most fun to join, and this is just voluntary. It's not created by the military. It's just that the culture has so adapted this stuff, and the schools in the United States as well have firing ranges, and you're able to object to them because of the poisonings put into the air in the schools, but not because of the militarism. And the schools, high schools, hand over to the U.S. military with no notice the results of extensive exams that the kids are not told are military tests. And the federal government has given parents the right to opt out, to not have their kids' information and contact information and test results handed over to the military to aid in recruitment efforts. But in very few states are the parents actually informed of this. So there's a good website you can check out if you want to see how this campaign is going at studentprivacy.org. This question of war and racism, they go hand in hand. They fuel each other. And in the United States, there's this idea that you can, bomb 7 or 8 foreign countries in ways that you would not be getting away with were those countries understood as white. And not be promoting racism at home. So I had people telling me that we should cheer for Hillary Clinton because she wasn't an overt racist. You know, this had become the standard. If you're not an overt racist, if you're not out there demanding racist violence at your rallies, you know, as Donald Trump did, promising to pay people's legal bills if they beat up the black people at his events, well, then that's acceptable standards. But, you know, I look around Charlottesville, Virginia, this, you know, small town I live in, and, you know, the statues downtown are all about a war to defend slavery that were put up, you know, 60 years after, well, yeah, about 60 years after the war to defend slavery as part of a campaign to advance racism, and were put up in parks that were, you know, exclusively white people were allowed in those parks and so forth. And I sort of think, okay, I'm with the people who want to get rid of the racist war statues. But then I look around the rest of Charlottesville and I see statues glorifying the genocide of Native Americans. And I think, now, how is that not a racist war statue? And I see memorials to the war on Vietnam that killed, you know, nearly 4 million Vietnamese, plus millions of people in Laos and Cambodia. And Vietnamese is not the word that was ever used by the people doing it to describe in their racist terms the people they were slaughtering. And I think, how is that not a racist war monument? And I look on the campus of the University of Virginia, and I see a monument to World War I, which, you know, nowadays you would sort of ahistorically, you know, having been through U.S. schools and not learned anything, think, oh, World War I, well, that was a good non-racist war because that was white people against white people. No, it was explicitly promoted as a racist war in those terms, with those words, as a war against the evil race of Huns, you know, and you can't have a non-racist war. It doesn't work. You can't engage in the mass murder of men, women, and children. You can't have presidents, you know, openly advertising that on Tuesdays they're going down lists of men, women, and children and picking whom to murder with missiles from robot airplanes, without racism, without dehumanizing the people you're doing it to. You can't have the Israeli military training U.S. police forces in how to treat the U.S. public as war enemies without instilling in them the sort of thinking that treats Palestinians as less than human. You know, and when you have a society like the United States full of racism, you know, itself internally generating racism, that can't help but facilitate the militarism. So that the two play off each other. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King, who's, you know, been turned into Santa Claus and celebrated with a holiday, you know, the actual person, Dr. King, said we have to go after racism and militarism and extreme materialism, this vicious consumption of physical objects, this greed and consumerism, all at once. If we're gonna get rid of any of these, you know, this evil triplets, as he called them.
That is fascinating, completely fascinating to hear you say, because I have noticed how the history, not just of war, but actually of activism, is completely modified by the state. We have seen this on a small scale in New Zealand, but it's really remarkable what you just said, which is that Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King, was not just about civil rights and racial equality, but actually addressing militarism and capitalism as being inherently connected to civil rights issues. You simply don't hear that. I've certainly, you know, never heard that. So that is really remarkable. I'd like to thank you for what you just said about Hillary Clinton and your stance relating to Hillary Clinton, because I am frequently up against feminists, self-professed feminists, who are what I call Clinton feminists. And Clinton feminists are the type of feminists that are obsessively pro-feminism, provided that the women in question do not happen to be in a war zone. And where they are in a war zone that is being bombed by the past Obama and Clinton regime or any other regime previously, all of a sudden then those women don't matter, those women don't get a voice, those women don't deserve human rights and respect, and those women are not advocated for. However, they are, dead set on promoting and advancing the causes of their own type of women, usually meaning a white woman of the West. And for me, feminism has to be global. Like you cannot divorce the rights of Western women from the rights of any other woman on the planet. And I'm personally disgusted by the warmongers and the war profiteers who hide behind feminism and activism causes and who attempt to co-opt those causes for their own gain. And we see that with, for example, the Women's March. At the end of the Women's March, they had a bunch of celebrity speakers get up on the stage, and one of them listed off a bunch of women luminaries throughout history, like, the Kate Shepherds and the Rosa Parks, and then tagged on the name Hillary Clinton at the end of their list of luminaries throughout women's history and women's liberation. And for me, that was despicable. How can you take someone who has destroyed the lives of millions of women and hold them up as a luminary of feminism? It is completely antithetical to the concept. So I really appreciate that you have taken that principled stance of delineating the differences between, the Clinton racism and the Clinton feminism, and what the real core issues of racism and feminism, which apply to every country on this planet, every war that we've ever had, and all of our civil struggles. So the next thing that I wanted to talk to you about was your kayaktivism. So I heard this term, I was reading through your event about how you were kayaking to the Pentagon in this flotilla, this protest action, and I saw that you had called it kayaktivism, and I thought that that was just hilarious and sounded like something that could definitely catch on. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about that event, what's happening, when it's happening, and what you're seeking to achieve with it.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with you completely about Hillary Clinton as a historic hero of feminism or anything else. I mean, to take one of the few human beings on earth who could lose an election to Donald Trump and have her do so, and then celebrate her as, advancing the cause of anything good or decent in the world is problematic. But someone that openly corrupt, someone, giving those speeches to Goldman Sachs, someone taking those bribes from those military contractors and foreign nations and enacting those policies as Secretary of State, someone in the tradition of Madeleine Albright, who was Secretary of State back in the 90s and who came more recently here to Charlottesville, and you can catch a YouTube I made of her on YouTube, where I asked her, about her famous comment that killing 500,000 children in Iraq through sanctions was worth it, whatever it may have been. And she said to me that she regretted and was sorry she had said that, but she was not sorry she had done it. And I asked her, how many children in Iran? Is there a problem with imposing sanctions on Iran? Oh, no, that's totally acceptable. That's totally different, right? So they learned nothing. And we had this election, where we had the two least popular candidates for president in the history of the United States, most opposition to both big political parties since the U.S. politics has become dominated by two parties. And you had people saying we have to choose between the candidate who will bomb the Muslims and the candidate who will try to ban Muslims entering this country, fleeing, refugees fleeing the bombings. And yet it was, very clear that with Donald Trump, you might get someone who would bomb them as well as try to ban them entering the country. With Hillary Clinton, you were just likely to get someone more eager to bomb more of them. So, not a really good choice, but because of the partisanship, you now run up against, well, we shouldn't really try to impeach Trump for continuing all of these wars because we would be called hypocrites because we didn't try to impeach Obama for continuing and expanding and starting all of these wars. So this is how, having the two different parties with two different names, but agreement on the evilest of the policies really kills the opposition, kills the activism, because once, the warrantless spying that, when Bush was president, I led a team of dozens of people who drafted dozens of articles of impeachment, and we worked with Congressman Dennis Kucinich, who introduced 34 or 35 of them on the floor of the House. And one of them was warrantless spying, and one of them was lawless imprisonment. And, there's, a half dozen of them that the identical crimes have been committed by Obama and now by Trump. But because, half the country accepted it when it was Bush and the other half accepted it when it was Obama, now nobody wants to say no to it, even to wars. So we have to look for those things that only Trump has done. So let's impeach him for banning Muslims entering the country, but let's say nothing about bombing their homes in the first place because we said nothing when Obama was doing it. This is a problem. And you're absolutely right about, what feminism looks like. Amnesty International took out big ads with pictures of an Afghan woman to thank NATO when NATO met in Chicago, to thank NATO for bombing Afghanistan for, human rights, women's rights, every right except that of not being bombed. But to get to your question, I didn't invent the term kayaktivism. It came out of, Seattle, Washington, and the Pacific Northwest, and groups like the Backbone Campaign, which are helping World Beyond War plan this flotilla at the Pentagon. But, most people don't know that the Pentagon is the biggest polluter on Earth. Most people don't know that the Pentagon is the biggest polluter of the Potomac River on which sits the Pentagon. And there's just this little lagoon off the Potomac River right up to the edge of the Pentagon, and we're going to fill it with kayaks and other boats with giant banners with the messages, not just no more wars for oil, but no more oil for wars, no more support for the biggest polluter, the biggest cause of these rising waters. I mean, these are tidal ocean waters here in front of the Pentagon that are rising because of the work of the Pentagon. And so, go to worldbeyondwar.org and sign up if you can make it to Washington, D.C. on September 17th. And this is, shortly before our conference on war and the environment, September 22nd to 24th. But, feel free to plagiarize anything and do similar events elsewhere, and get in touch with the Backbone Campaign at backbonecampaign.org if you want tips on how to lock kayaks together and raise giant banners and not drown and so forth.
Oh, wow. What you're just saying about refugees is so true. So this is a huge topic of conversation in New Zealand at the moment, is immigration and the number of refugees that we accept or don't accept. And I constantly get asked about immigration and refugees, and I respond that if we don't want to take in refugees, we need to stop creating them. Is the demonization of refugees just yet another service to the war industry? Why have we seen this prevalence, particularly over the last few years, of the demonization of refugees?
It's, in part, it's because of the increase in refugees, which is hitting record levels and is largely, not entirely, but largely the result of wars in in Syria and throughout the region of the Horn of Africa and the Middle East, and partly the result of environmental catastrophe, which is in turn partly the result of wars, and in some cases part of the excuse for more wars. But in terms of ideology in our communication system, and especially seen from the viewpoint here within the United States that I can speak to best, we've seen this incredible advance in the dehumanization of Muslims and creation of incredible bigotry toward Muslims, and to the point where we can have presidential candidates asked in debates, would you kill hundreds and thousands of innocent children as part of your basic responsibilities as president, where we can have presidents run on a campaign of banning Muslims from entering the country. And as we've had more and more immigrants coming into the United States, and first and foremost immigrants from south of the border, Spanish-speaking immigrants from Mexico and Latin America coming into the United States, we've seen, the application of the ideology and the weaponry and the contractors of the military business applied to surveillance of activism and militarization of the border and construction of the wall and the cameras and the deployment of the drones and the manned aircraft and womaned aircraft and all of the militarization of local and border police. And we've seen an encouraging and admirable movement for what's called immigrants' rights in the United States. But it's not been about refugee rights. It's not been about mentioning what's creating much of the immigration in the first place. It's not been about war, to the point where you have some of the best advocates for immigrants' rights in the United States advocating for a piece of legislation in Congress that they call the DREAM Act. And it's not my dream. It's not even Dr. King's dream. But the dream is that if you've come to the United States without legal acceptance, if you happen to win the lottery, you can go to college. And if you don't, you can participate in U.S. wars. And either way, you get to be an acceptable U.S. citizen. This is a problem, from thousands of angles we don't have time to go into. But when the U.S. wars are having a hard time recruiting enough U.S. participants, despite, the mechanization and the use of robot airplanes and so forth, to have them increasingly dependent on, open private mercenaries and, foreign proxies, and turning to immigrants, to do what Americans don't want to do. That is not just work at McDonald's and clean floors and take care of children, but participate in the wars. That takes away one of the levers for opposing the wars. It hurts our ability to stop the wars by refusing to participate in them, when they can go and dangle citizenship in front of people who, in many cases, whose countries have been damaged by U.S. militarism and U.S. training of militaries and so-called intelligence operations in their countries, and get the cannon fodder for the wars that way. This is a major problem. And so we need a refugee rights movement, and we need it to take on wars, and we need it to work in partnership with those organizations that are directly taking on war. And we need the ability to say, not just, oh, those poor people in Texas, and not even just, oh, those poor people in Bangladesh, but also, oh, those poor people in Yemen, even though the people in Yemen are suffering, because of U.S. And U.S. Saudi war making.
And the Saudis are yet again another bridge between both the Obama administration and the Trump administration. So for all of the anti-Muslim rhetoric and all of the overt racism, we see Trump doing a sword dance and stroking the orb at the Saudi counterterrorism center within weeks of taking up the presidency. How is it that we seem to be immune to the hypocrisy that's right in our face?
Well, there's been this toxic partnership between Saudi Arabia's government and the U.S. government going back to the days of World War II and prior. And, you know, many so-called think tanks that are sort of anti-think tanks in the United States have Saudi money. Just as, I mean, I was watching a story on US TV in the past couple of days about, you know, how you can get fired for criticizing Google, you know, at a so-called think tank, because there's hardly any think tanks that aren't funded by Google. Well, the same is true for Saudi Arabia, which of course put at least $10 million that we know of into the Clinton Family Foundation, while Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was making it her personal mission to get waivers and get approvals to hurry up the sale of more Boeing airplanes to Saudi Arabia, while also taking in nearly $1 million from Boeing. You know, this level of corruption doesn't get into U.S. media. You know, you can't even get in criticism of Saudi Arabian support for terrorism in the United States, much less around the region of the Middle East. You know, it's a topic like criticism of the U.S. military or the Israeli military that's got a lot of taboos, that's very hard to communicate. And yet, when you're able to, through, you know, a medium like this one, talk about it, well, you know, the case is overwhelming that, you know, and occasionally it's made it into, you know, the front page of the Washington Post, that these famines and these disease epidemics, you know, in first and foremost in Yemen, but in a handful of countries across that region and Northeast Africa, are, you know, created by war and maintained by war. And the war on Yemen could not be happening without the participation of the U.S. military, which is, you know, refueling the Saudi planes midair and giving the Saudi planes targets and so forth. You know, this is creating the worst disease epidemics, famines, poverty, homelessness, you know, the worst disaster to hit a country. And it's a very poor country to begin with. And they were warned. They were, you know, they were warned explicitly and accurately. There was you know, a few years back, there was a young man from Yemen who, because he had been through a program through the State Department and attended college in the United States and was sort of predicted to be an acceptable witness, was a witness at a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C. And the day before he went to testify, his village in Yemen was bombed, you know, by U.S. drones. And to his credit, he went in and said, the United States is hurting itself, and Yemen is doing more to support and produce terrorists in Yemen than the terrorists in Yemen ever could have done alone. These drones are turning these terrorists into heroes for a segment of the Yemeni population, which, like any other population, doesn't appreciate being bombed, and not just bombed, but the endless night and day buzzing of the drones overhead, threatening instant death at any moment, traumatizing our children. And so, you know, they were explicitly advised of not just the humanitarian outrage and the criminal actions they were engaged in, but the counterproductive nature. I mean, every time a top U.S. military or quote unquote intelligence official retires, there's a good chance they're about to blurt out that it's all counterproductive, that they're producing more enemies than they're killing. And yet it rolls on. So that, Bernie Sanders, who was, this, shining light for the Democratic Party and many progressives in the United States, and who actually has good policy positions on many issues, was, his, progressive position on war and peace was that Saudi Arabia should get its hands dirty. Saudi Arabia should fund more of the wars, as if the wars are this good philanthropic project the world depends on. You can't, we don't want to have too few wars. You got to keep the wars funded. But Saudi Arabia should do more of the funding of the wars so that the United States doesn't have to fund as many wars. But if you want to create, killer first strike, non-defensive, disastrous, can't even fly airplanes in Burlington, Vermont, where Bernie Sanders is from, well, that's okay because that's jobs, even though military spending actually eliminates jobs, you actually get more jobs through any other kind of spending or not taxing the money in the first place. Because the US Congress will only spend money on military, they see military spending as jobs, and people around the world have to hear that they're dying and being threatened with bases and weaponry in order to produce jobs in Burlington, Vermont.
Yeah, it's incredibly unbelievable. And especially I feel like the media have so much culpability in this, and the media themselves don't take it seriously. So I know from having contact and having observed a number of mainstream journalists over the last 5 or 6 years, I see two themes. One is that they know that their organizations are corrupt and that they're corrupt from the top down, but they feel completely bound and unable to do anything about it. But then at the same time, they feel that they're not personally liable for that they, it's that whole, I'm just one person, what can I do about it thing? And so they kind of excuse it. They know it's happening, but they excuse it at the same time. And then the other end of that is there are some very young recruits straight out of journalism school in New Zealand, particularly who I'm referring to, who openly tell me, but we have the freest media in the world. We are so blessed to be able to speak so freely. And of course, it's like total and utter farce, right? We have the same journalism model as America, just like we have the same military model as America. We have the same intelligence model as America. We are increasingly having the same education model as America. The idea that New Zealand is different from America in terms of its key institutions is completely ludicrous at this point. Everything from austerity to privatization to militarization, and the whole playbook has been rolled out in New Zealand over a number of decades. But we see the media in the United States get visibly excited every time that Trump starts banging the war drums. We've had the key, as Glenn Greenwald has wonderfully pointed out on several occasions, all of a sudden Trump becomes presidential in the eyes of the media as soon as he's willing to kill people. Even though the same media are usually set against him on it pretty avidly on a daily basis. So what I wanted to ask you is, what is the historical and the current context of the media's role in promoting war?
Well, that's a huge topic with, a whole shelves of wonderful literature about. And I wrote a book called War is a Lie that looks at the types of lies that the media uses. But it's, every time you're right that Donald Trump acts like a 3-year-old, a poorly behaved 3-year-old, not a good 3-year-old, threatens to nuke North Korea. The U.S. media calls him presidential, says he now has credibility. Now he's worth, bowing down before, as we must all unite behind the office of the presidency and so forth. It's really repulsive. Sometimes, to an increasing extent, in some cases, the U.S. public is able to resist the lies of the media. So, you actually back 4 years ago had the president of the United States pushing YouTubes of dead children's bodies and telling us that we were in favor of that or of bombing the hell out of Syria, and we needed to choose. And the public said, no, we don't want to bomb the hell out of Syria. And of course, the evidence that the president claimed to have about who had, killed those children was non-existent. And there is a real problem with what fear and patriotism and the war drums do to rational thinking. Because when the same president then showed the US public videos of members of the group ISIS killing people with knives rather than nuclear weapons, which everyone knows knives are much worse than nuclear bombs, then you saw opposition to war crumble, and the US government able to escalate its role actually on both sides of the same war in Syria without any demand for logic or coherence or legality, because of the fear factor. And so we have to learn to recognize how the propaganda works and to recognize the lies the minute we see them. But we also have to learn to resist the temptation to be afraid, which weakens those abilities. So what I advise people in terms of recognizing the lies that are coming out of their televisions is to first of all understand that they're answering the wrong questions, right? The question is not, does Iraq have nuclear, biological, chemical weapons that would justify bombing the hell out of Iraq? It's not the right question, because the United States undeniably indisputably, and doesn't deny it, has all of those weapons, and there's no legal or moral justification for bombing the hell out of the United States. There's not going to be anything legal or moral or even strategic on its own terms about bombing the hell out of Iraq, no matter what the answer to the question. And it's the same with the questions about Iran's supposed nuclear weapons program or Syrian supposed chemical weapons attacks or Russian supposed shootings of airplanes or violent conquests of territories where the people voted to rejoin Russia. It's always the wrong questions, and so we have to address the details of the claims and the supposed evidence when there is any supposed evidence that Russia stole our election or whatever. But we have to, separate that from the idea that one answer to the question is going to legally or morally justify another war. So I think to a great extent, even, the more independent media get hooked on the questions that the US government or other governments or major corporate, effective government media, even if it claims to be non-state media, want us asking, and then try to give better answers to the questions. We ought to be asking completely different questions, like what would you do if you wanted peace in Korea, rather than, did North Korea really put a bomb on a missile, and is their president really a sociopath who orders every male in North Korea to get the same haircut he does, as if that would then require, bombing his country.
Yeah, the propaganda is just ridiculous, and it's so pervasive.
Yeah. I don't know, Susie, if you saw these YouTubes from these guys in Australia who went to North Korea to get a haircut because they, had seen all these straight-faced reports on CNN and all the media outlets about how the president had required everyone to get his same haircut. And, of course, they couldn't find anybody in North Korea who had ever heard of that. But, which says nothing about North Korea being a model society to emulate. But the lies are just so ludicrous, and nobody bothers to check, and nobody cares, and nobody corrects them afterwards.
Right, and we've seen the same thing, of course, with Russia, right? Obviously, you were here a short time ago in Russia, and I was able to meet you and hang out with you, which was amazing. And the size of the lies that are told, the egregiousness of the propaganda, once you are here and see the reality, actually diminishes the real problems, because there are real problems in Russia. There is poverty and there is homelessness, but it's at such a minuscule fraction of the extent that is promoted as being the case by the media, that when I got here, I just couldn't, it was like a different country to anything I'd ever heard of. And I know that you had some of the same experiences. I read the report from the team of international observers that you're with, for example, and they had met with media organizations around Russia. And one of the lies that is told about Russia is that there is no opposition media in Russia, that you're not allowed to be opposition media, that you cannot speak against the presidency or against the government at all. And yet I know that your team of observers just discovered for themselves that, in fact, most of the print media in Russia and in Moscow is, in fact, opposition papers and opposition organizations, although the TV channels do tend to be state media. And we see exactly the same thing in New Zealand in terms of state media, state-controlled TV. For example, our TV stations in New Zealand have not interviewed me even one time about the Internet Party campaign or about my asylum or about anything at all. They do not acknowledge that our campaign exists. They will not share any of our messages. They will not acknowledge these events, which we have been incredibly successful events that we've been having. They won't address any of the issues at all or tell the public it's even occurring. And then they hold a poll of the public about who they're going to vote for, and they stick our Internet Party in the poll. And then when their viewership, who hasn't even been told that we are campaigning, doesn't say that they're voting for us, then the TV news reports Internet Party at 0%. Then they use their poll result of 0% Internet Party to justify not giving us any coverage or acknowledging what we're doing at all. So it's like this completely manufactured, vicious cycle designed to prevent our messages, our anti-war, pro-civil liberties, pro-privacy messages from getting through to the public. And it's interesting because the public in New Zealand are very, very anti-US empire, very anti-war, very pro-privacy, very anti-surveillance, very active. We have had humongous movements in the last 5 or 6 years on relating to these issues, both NZ for Gaza, campaigning against the war on the Palestinians, the GCSB movement, campaigning in towns and cities throughout New Zealand, the general public absolutely screaming that they do not want their privacy violated by the government and by the spy agencies. And the state-controlled media in New Zealand, and when I say state-controlled, it's actually private, it's corporation-controlled media. It's equally about profit as much as it is about government and maintaining the status quo. But they know that the public is sympathetic to the issues that the Internet Party is raising. And they know that if they let the public be aware that we are campaigning on these issues, that we have initiatives to do something about it, that we want to take on the powers that be, that would gain massive traction with the New Zealand public. So they suppress us specifically to deprive the public of having our platform as an outlet to vent their rage about what has been done to them and what is being done to them every day. And then we have the media at the same time holding up the two major parties in New Zealand as being the only solution to the problems which have been created by those two major parties. And just like in America, our two major parties, our right-wing and left-wing party, both of them have signed on to anti-terrorism legislation, you know, reams of it, not even one piece of it, but literally every year there's another bill or another two bills that's taking it a step further. Both of those major parties have signed those bills. Both of them have embraced the US military agenda. Both of them have been in government and have allowed Waihopai Spy Base in New Zealand and other bases that have been revealed to be operating in New Zealand to collaborate with the US government in its wars, in its illegal wars. They pretend that they haven't, but it's happening every single day. And we know full well now that those bases are involved in drone targeted, so-called targeted killing operations. If you can use the words targeted killing when you have hundreds and thousands of civilians being slaughtered by, as you say, you know, flying killer robots. This is all happening every day and continuing every day. And yet the public is being told, vote for one of these two parties. This is the solution. And we know it's not the solution. We know that whichever of those two parties gets in this election, our spy bases will continue to support illegal American wars. We will continue to have blood on our hands. We will continue to be implicated in war crimes, as both New Zealand and Australia have been now implicated in war crimes in Afghanistan. So we are suppressed by the media, but we are still doing our damnedest to try to raise these issues, because it is a moral imperative to get the message out however we can and to try to show people that there is an alternative. So my question to you is, what are the best and most effective ways for people to act to end war, to end drones, to shut down these spy bases? What do we need to do? What can we do?
Well, luckily, elections are only one tool. And luckily, popular movements that have changed the world for the better have depended heavily on other tools, you know, in addition to elections. Women didn't vote themselves the right to vote anywhere. The right to vote was created in the usual way, that is through popular education and mobilizing in nonviolent interference and resistance. And so if we can, you know, work to shame the countries that are holding back on joining a treaty to ban the possession of nuclear weapons, for example, and advance that as part of an agenda that educates people about ending the entire institution of war. You know, because if you don't end the United States military aggressiveness using non-nuclear weapons, you're not going to get places like North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons. But when you have, you know, the German foreign minister this week agreeing that Germany needs to get US nukes out of Germany and out of other countries and ban nuclear weapons everywhere, when you have, you know, people in the Netherlands forcing their government to take on the US nukes in their country and in Europe, you know, this is a way to start to take a step. But I think we need education, we need communications, we need the advancement of agreements and treaties, and we need to use elections as, you know, as one tool among many. But as you know, I did communications for a presidential campaign in the United States for Congressman Dennis Kucinich, and we would go to events where there were, you know, some 10 Democratic Party candidates for president debating each other, you know, sometimes fewer than 10, several, you know, debating each other. And Congressman Kucinich would often win the most applause, the greatest number of standing ovations, apparently the greatest support. But you could walk around the room and talk to people, and they would say to you, Kucinich is the guy I would vote for if he had a chance. If Kucinich's campaign were real, I would be voting for him. Well, why am I cheering for him? Because if he were serious, if he were actually running to be president and not doing this vanity thing he's doing, and I would look at these people and say, my God, I've never met anyone who was more serious about anything. He believed he was going to be president, not just, wanted to be, but believed it was about to happen, but because people obey their televisions, right? Because I could go to Occupy events. I know, Suzie, you were part of the Occupy movement. I could go to Occupy events after the television networks had lost interest in Occupy. And the events, weren't much smaller in the months after the television stations lost interest. But I would talk to people there, and they would tell you the Occupy movement was dead. They would tell you it was over, because what was on TV was more real than where they were, as an actual person, outside of television existence. And so I think part of what we have to do is recognize our own power, recognize reality outside of TV, outside of the corporate media, and develop the ability to communicate with each other, because we couldn't have created an Occupy movement without the television networks creating it in New York in the first place. So we have to have the ability to create such things on our own. People go after somebody like Bernie Sanders, why won't he denounce the Democratic Party? Why won't he, form a third party, and yet for most of them, if he hadn't done what he did within the Democratic Party, they never would have heard of him, because the US corporate media just covers two parties. And, there's the two parties organize the debates, and keep out anyone from the other parties. And so we have to create independent movements and independent candidates with independent communication systems, and recognition that those communication systems are real, that what you and I are saying to each other counts even when it's not on CNN, and recognize the number of people who are informed, who are seeing independent media, that when CNN tells you that opposition to war is some, fringe idea, go and look at CNN's own polls and look at what people are actually saying, rather than what CNN or MSNBC or these other outlets are telling you. Because, we aren't getting the communications we need. When I was in Moscow with you in the spring, people were here in Charlottesville at the Robert E. Lee statue, holding up torches and chanting Nazi slogans, blood and soil and so forth, and chanting, Russia is our friend, Russia is our friend. And I had to explain to, and I had Russians there asking me in Moscow, I don't understand. We didn't have slavery. We aren't in favor of slavery. What are they, and I had to explain to them that everybody in the United States has a television. And so everybody believes that Russia made Donald Trump president. And people on the right, racists who feel empowered by Donald Trump, have, just accepted that without evidence as well, and are thanking Russia for making Donald Trump president. And people who oppose Donald Trump have accepted that as well without evidence, and oppose Donald Trump for all kinds of legitimate reasons that nobody in Russia is being told about, because he has disastrous domestic policies and racist policies and financial corruption and so forth. That there are reasons people dislike Donald Trump other than disliking Russia. That in fact, most people in the United States are coming around to disliking Russia because they dislike Donald Trump first, rather than the other way around, which nobody in Russia has any idea. You come back to the United States, and nobody in the United States has any idea that anybody in Russia is a human being, or as you say, that there's any opposition media at all. And in fact, in the United States, the justification for all the military spending has become first and foremost Russian aggression. Even though Russian aggression, if it exists, pales in comparison to U.S. aggression. And you have the weapons profiteers in the United States openly saying that the hostility toward Russia is for weapons sales and for, bureaucratic inertia and NATO and so forth. You have a completely different understanding of the world. This is why you have to physically go to other countries. You have a completely different understanding of the world in these two places, created by very similar media systems, where the big outlets are pushing the government line, and the opposition outlets are, disproportionately things you have to read rather than watch, and things that aren't given the same status, even when they have, a large number of readers or viewers.
Yeah, the attempt to tie Russia to the racism and the neo-Nazism is just completely insane. The day before I met you, actually the day before you arrived here, was Victory Day in Russia, which is the biggest day of the calendar year. And 800,000 people in Moscow marched into a Red Square, and in celebration of the victory over the Nazis. Nazis are reviled in Russia because Russia lost, 26 million people in World War II. Nazis are considered to be scum of the earth in Russia. There is no sympathy for them whatsoever. This is a multicultural society here in Moscow and in Russia, and that's okay. And racial tolerance is promoted here and has been promoted since World War II. I'm sure possibly prior to that, but in my knowledge, certainly since World War II and the victory over the Nazis. So the idea that Russia is being associated with neo-Nazism when Russian society and politics is completely opposed to neo-Nazism is just yet another example of what I consider to be a psyop. And it's a psyop that is being perpetuated, as you say, to the benefit of the weapons manufacturers. And it's interesting that you mentioned them, because yesterday I watched a documentary called Merchants of War, and it was about weapons manufacturers, and it interviewed both private and government weapons salesmen from around the world. And there was two things that I took away from that documentary. One is that these people have utterly deluded themselves into believing that despite the fact that they profit off the death of millions of people, that they have no personal responsibility whatsoever, that it's other people pulling the trigger, and therefore it's totally fine that it's them supplying the weapons and pushing the development of the weapons and really just helping to destroy the planet. They feel no culpability whatsoever for that. The second thing that I took away from it is that every country and every military and every government is a friend of the weapons manufacturers. There was no ideological lines involved. There was the same people supplying and doing deals with opposing factions of every war on the planet, quite open, not even openly, but actually advocating for it. To them, it is literally business. And this is something that the public struggles to understand, because we can't understand why would the US supply ISIS with weapons. A very good friend of mine is the mother of Serena Shim, who's an extremely brave American journalist who lost her life after she was killed in Turkey, after having revealed that the US was involved in using NGO trucks to traffic weapons and soldiers to ISIS across the Turkish border into Syria. People can't understand, why would the US do that? Why would they arm the opposition? We look back to the Iran-Iraq war in the 80s, and it's exactly the same situation. We have these people, same people supplying both Iran and Iraq with weaponry. And to us, it makes no sense whatsoever. How could they do that? How can they tell us, such and such is the bad guys, but then simultaneously be arming that very same group. And when you watch this documentary about the war manufacturers, everything clicks into place, because all of a sudden you understand it's not about the ideology. They use ideology to create the fractures, to create the conflict, but they service both sides of the conflict because of money.
Yeah.
Money and power and control. So while the government and the media is telling us to hate this group of people or hate that group of people, and I believe that this even extends to the current ideological divides in activism in the United States. I believe personally that both sides are infiltrated and that both sides are being subjected to a massive divide and conquer program. That even when the government is telling us who the bad guys are, the government knows full well that it is profiting off supplying both sides of the conflict. So at a certain point in time, the creation and maintenance of conflict has become the most profitable endeavor of these governments in terms of lining their own pockets. Not profitable for the people, not profitable for our societies at all. It's extremely destructive at every level. But they are, in fact, engaged in supporting both sides of every war that is currently going on this planet. Do you agree with me?
I do. You know, there is this pattern of promoting wars to damage multiple participants, so that you can look at, you know, many examples going back through history, but Harry Truman, who as president would approve the bombing with nukes of Japanese cities, as senator had said, if Germany's winning, let's help the Russians. If the Russians are winning, let's help the Germans. That way, more of them will die. You know, more people will die. This was the, you know, the approach of the United States to World War II, prior to, you know, getting involved and then, you know, claiming to have won it through 10,000 Hollywood movies, was let the Germans and the Russians kill each other to the maximum extent. As you say, the Iran-Iraq war, various other wars, it's become common in wars these days for U.S. weaponry to be on multiple sides, so that in the overthrow of the Libyan government, for example, the two sides could have exchanged parts in their guns because they were, you know, U.S. guns. You have, you know, U.S. armed and U.S. trained troops in Syria fighting U.S. armed and trained troops in Syria, sometimes CIA troops fighting Department of so-called defense troops in Syria. This has become the norm. But it's not, you know, to say that it's every country around the world. I mean, it's really the United States and Russia are the top two weapons dealers to the world. And it's really about 6 countries that dominate weapon sales to the world. The U.S., you know, in recent years, by various measures, is in first place in weapons to poor countries, weapons to the Middle East, you know, and these are weapons sold and given to dictatorships, to so-called democracies, you know, across the political spectrum. And you have the Pope come and tell a joint session of the U.S. Congress, your hands are soaked in blood, stop the arms trade, and and they give them a standing ovation, but they don't stop the arms trade. They continue right along, unaltered. But it's the big permanent Security Council members dominating the supposed institution of the United Nations set up to eliminate war, plus Germany, that are, you know, dominating the sale of weapons. And most of the places where the wars are don't make weapons at all, you know. And I look back at, you know, the provision of alcohol to Native Americans, the pushing of drugs on the Chinese, you know, where Franklin Roosevelt's family's money came from, among other people. And you look at the pushing of weapons on poor countries, and there's never any consideration of ceasing to do so. right? I mean, never does the conversation around Iraq or Pakistan or Syria or Afghanistan or Yemen deal with, proposals to stop arming the place. It's always whom to arm, whom to identify, as the moderate murderers to further arm. And this is what you see in U.S. thinking, so that in Charlottesville, Virginia, where I'm sitting, you have this discussion now of whether we should limit the First Amendment rights to speak and assemble, because these fascists are speaking and assembling and people are getting killed. And never is there any question of, well, how about we allow them to speak and assemble unarmed? And you have the U.S. police, the police in Charlottesville have mine-resistant vehicles. Do you know how many minefields there are in Charlottesville? I mean, not metaphorical, but literal minefield. We don't have, there are no cluster bombs yet in Charlottesville, and we have mine-resistant vehicles. This is the question is, should the police, because in July, the Ku Klux Klan from North Carolina came and had a rally in Charlottesville, and the police showed up looking like a military and attacked people, and some people, to their credit, objected. Well, this is the excuse for the police showing up looking like a military in August and then standing by and watching people beaten by fascists. So the conversation now is, well, should they have been more heavily armed? And should they have attacked people more quickly? But there's never any consideration of, countries in Europe and elsewhere where the cops are not even armed with guns and seem to do okay. I remember when we were in Moscow, Suzie, I think you may have been pointing out to me that, a guy gets pulled over by the police and jumps out and runs back to the police car to say, hey, what'd you pull me over for?
Yeah.
In the United States, that guy was dead. In the United States, that guy would be dead. It's counterproductive, but it's the same kind of thinking domestically and internationally, where it's weapons overall, weapons first and foremost, and then consider, what policies will work best once we've armed everybody to the teeth. And in many cases, there aren't any policies that will work anymore once you've armed everybody to the teeth.
I'm really interested to know if you see what I see in terms of the divide and conquer. Let me try and explain a little bit. You just touched on it there, one of the key factors, the key pieces of evidence when you said the police standing by and doing nothing. So through the Occupy movement, I witnessed many actions. I promoted actions, I attended actions, but I also eyewitnessed live streams from around the world of actions that were happening at occupiers all over the globe. And uniformly, every single one of those actions was citizens against the state, citizens against police. So the citizens were protesting, and they're protesting about something that the governments have done, and the agents of the state, the police forces, show up to oppose them, and whatever conflict occurred between the citizenry and between the state forces. That changed very recently. That changed. And so now what we see at Berkeley, and now what we see in Charlottesville, in the shadow of like Baltimore and the last few years of really serious like civil, or almost borderline civil uprising against abuses by the state forces, we're now seeing, instead of citizens against the state and the agents of the state, we're now seeing citizens against citizens. When I look at Berkeley, when I look at Charlottesville, I see protesters fighting protesters. And the police agencies, the agents of the state who used to be the targets, the bad guys, the opposition, are now standing there eating popcorn while the civilians fight the civilians. And when I looked closely at the Berkeley footage, I noticed that I could actually pick out the agent provocateurs. So we've seen the agent provocateurs at work at No NATO, in Chicago a few years back. We've seen them back as far as Seattle in 1999, the so-called Battle of Seattle. They are the agitators. They are the ones that are there to start the fight, to start the fires, to really ratchet things up and to get everyone in trouble, to bring the felony charges, you know, to make it an unlawful assembly, to provide the pretext by which the government can then crack down. So regardless of the obvious narratives, and by obvious narratives, I mean, yes, of course, neo-Nazis are freaking disgusting. Yes, of course, racism is abhorrent. You know, again, it's the ideology is being used to fracture people. So there's never any argument amongst average normal people that neo-Nazis are freaking despicable. I mean, I don't know anybody that's ever been like, yeah, neo-Nazis are awesome. Like, I just don't know anyone that's ever been like that. And yes, I know there are some crazy nut jobs like the David Dukes of this world who are, like, literally, in my opinion, demented and therefore think that, you know, that is an ideology to celebrate. But the average person does not think that. So how has this, like, fringe minority ideology been used to turn citizens against citizens and turn protesters against protesters? How has the Trump versus Clinton electoral conflict become an on-the-ground conflict within the social and activism movements?
Yeah, it's a big topic, and you know, we certainly have seen infiltration of all sorts of groups, including nonviolent pacifist groups, by the U.S. government, and often seen provocation of violence by infiltrators, which is, you know, again, often the best way to spot them. It's not necessarily by their shoes anymore, but by who's pushing violence the hardest. And when you have violence from the left, and you know, sadly you always have some minority of those coming from the left pushing violence and acting aggressively. The corporate media will jump all over it, loves nothing better. So that you had the Ku Klux Klan depicted, you know, predictably depicted as the victims back in July in Charlottesville by the New York Times and others. You have to condemn the media for its eagerness to depict the left as violent, and its greater acceptance of violence by the right and by the government. But you have to expect it as well. It's predictable, it's predicted, and we have to stop giving them that chance. So it's not as if anti-fascist violent protesters are in each and every way absolutely identical, morally and otherwise, to neo-Nazis. Of course not. It's that strategically it's counterproductive in most cases, and there would be an enormous advantage to having a principled, disciplined, and nonviolent anti-Nazi movement and anti-war movement that communicated that it was such effectively. But not only do you see the infiltration and the provocation, but you see, as I said, a huge contrast in the regulation of these events. The anti-war, anti-racist, corporatist events are not permitted to be armed, and in most cases to have no interest in being armed, whereas these racists, are given the right to speak and assemble, threatening violence, having engaged in violence the night before, and visibly carrying semi-automatic weapons and knives and pepper spray and bats and clubs and shields and sticks and helmets, which, I just can't find. No matter how many times I read the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, I can't find any of that crap in there. And if you look then at after the events at who's been arrested, Well, at peace events and rallies for things good and decent, you often have, mass arrests of people who just were in the wrong place, even, passersby. You had this at Trump's inauguration. You have this in places like Ferguson or Baltimore. But after Charlottesville, it took, intense public pressure and independent media and forcing things into the corporate media for days and weeks before people got arrested for shooting guns in a crowd, for beating people with sticks on video. So there is, a contrast in how the left and right are treated by the police. And I think, part of it, I don't know to what extent exactly, but part of it is widespread police love for Donald Trump. And the incredible importance in the United States of partisanship, which is really hard to overstate. It's the reason for associating the Nazis with Russia is not just that you have neo-Nazis going over to visit Russia or talking up Russia or praising Russia as part of the future, fate of the white race or the white, whatever it is they call it, but simple partisanship that dominates everything. If Russia's identified as on Trump's side, Russia's good. That's it. Trump campaigned, for wars, against wars, denounced, every other Republican on earth and all their wars, and said the U.S. would stop overthrowing governments and so forth. And people didn't care. It was more important for them to vote for a racist, to vote for a right winger, to vote for a Republican, no matter what. But I think, you're right that most people don't like neo-Nazis, but most people also didn't want the racist statues to come down in Charlottesville until after the neo-Nazis had killed somebody. It's not as if it's black and white. Some people have a principled, informed understanding of how to rid the world of racism, and some people are neo-Nazis. I mean, there's a whole range in between, and I think we want to be very careful to avoid treating the neo-Nazis as subhuman in the way that the warmongers treat the North Koreans and the Iranians and the Russians, right? Because most of the neo-Nazis are not the cynical billionaires strategically using racism to get elected governor. Most of them are people who have shitty lives. Most of them are people who've seen suffering and abuse and unfairness, living in the most unequal society possibly to have ever existed on earth, and knowing it. And ahistorically, without education, make fun of their spelling, but recognize where that spelling comes from. They don't know anything. And they see a black kid get a college scholarship. They see a Latino kid, praised just for what looks to them like living a normal life. And they bitterly resent, that stand-up comedians are allowed to mock white people and make fun of their spelling and their dentistry and not other racial groups, because we've, developed a culture that turns against racism and against bigotry. And we have academia that, to its credit, is against racism and sexism and bigotry, but not against inequality of wealth and not against poor white people suffering. And so, they don't blame the billionaires. They don't blame the government. They don't blame the war profiteers. They blame Black people and Jews and gays and women, and it's toxic and it's deadly and it's wrong. But our job is actually to try to understand them and persuade them, which in many cases doesn't take much at all. I mean, there are many examples of talking people out of the Ku Klux Klan, rather than, demonizing them in the way that they demonize others.
I think there's a famous case of a Black civil rights activist who had debated or somehow come in contact with one of the Ku Klux Klan leaders and had actually managed to form a friendship with them. And by simply developing that very human relationship between the two of them, it was enough for the Ku Klux Klan member to have that light bulb go on over their head that actually this isn't about color and race. Actually, there are individual people and personalities and lives and experiences within all of the races. And once you connect to those, it's extremely powerful. That actually makes me think of something deeply personal to me that happened at Occupy, where we had this is actually hard for me to talk about. There was a man who had been convicted of multiple counts of rape. And I've written in the past myself about how I'm a survivor, and I've told this story, though I probably haven't relayed to that it was in fact a first person experience. At Occupy, I got to sit in a tent with a guy for an entire night, this convicted rapist, and talk with him about how he ended up becoming a rapist and the social conditioning that led to it. And I got to talk to him about my experiences as a woman and a survivor of rape. And it was an extremely eye-opening experience for both of us, because he was able to see things from my perspective and through my eyes, and I was able to understand the socialization that he had been subjected to that had led to this situation where he was perpetuating rape and violence against women. And sometimes it's not about excusing the behavior or accepting the behavior, but it is about understanding the behavior and understanding how it, and I'm getting all choked up, understanding how it has come to this, how we have gotten to this stage, how the violence against women is perpetuated. And it takes, I think, the opportunity to have that conversation, to humanize it for both sides. And what you said just before reminded me of a tweet from Internet Party account yesterday, I think, where it said that nobody's mind has ever been changed by ridicule or by hatred. We can't bridge the divide just by hating people or by ridiculing them. We can only bridge the divide by putting ourselves in each other's shoes. And it takes me back to what I was saying about your children's book, because that was the power of the book for me, was that it put the reader inside the lives of these people from these different cultures. It showed their lived experiences, their perspective, their cultural reality, and their geographic reality. And that's the key. I feel like it's the key to the healing, right? Like it's love heals, right? Like when you can find that little bit of love for someone, even if they are repulsive on the surface to you, even if they are alien on the surface to you, even if their behaviors or their social group or their class is abhorrent to you, if you can find that empathy for them, if you can put yourselves in their shoes, then it can completely change your viewpoint, and your willingness to do that can change their viewpoint.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're kind of running over time here. It's a shame, because I would like to talk to you all day long. I really would. I think this is such a powerful conversation to have, and such a necessary conversation to have. I wanted to quickly get a short take from you on each of the topics of the last 3 events that we've held, because I know that you have more knowledge about each of those and more insight. Then I'm going to invite Blake from our social media team to jump on the stream, and he's going to ask you some questions from people who've been viewing this on YouTube and Facebook. I know there's a number of questions for you from viewers. So the first thing I wanted to talk about quickly is, in our first event, we had Barrett Brown, who's an award-winning journalist and who was in federal prison for 5 years for his journalism and his activism. We had Laurie Love, who is a hacktivist and Courage Foundation beneficiary, who is under threat of extradition to the United States. And these are two really high-profile targets of the security apparatus. And I'm really interested to know in what ways you or the people, other activists in the organizations you worked for have been subjected to the so-called countermeasures of the military-industrial complex. In what ways have you experienced state suppression of your work?
I think you know, I can't give you you know, stories of myself being persecuted or prosecuted or spied on or abused. I mean, I certainly, I've gone to rallies where the police made comments that were clearly intended to communicate to us that they had just been reading our emails, you know, which I think is intended to be intimidating. I certainly, you know, for the past, you know, 15 years and more, have run into countless people who have been intimidated out of joining in activism because of government actions. I certainly, you know, in terms of what I think of as U.S. state media, although it's understood to be private for profit, although it's, you know, government media in many ways, establishment government media, even when it, you know, denounces Donald Trump as a buffoon. I've, you know, done interviews where I opposed U.S. war making and U.S. policies and then not heard from them again for months or years, even though I am absolutely convinced I would have had I had different opinions. You know, but it's the intimidation of activism and of whistleblowers that's so powerful. You know, to have people in the U.S. government absolutely terrified that they'll go to prison for life or worse if they speak out, and having them being instructed to spy on and rat on each other, you know, is, and we have, you know, people suggesting that, well, if there's a problem with Trump pardoning a racist criminal sheriff, there's a problem with Obama commuting a sentence for Chelsea Manning, you know, as if, you know, publicly blowing the whistle on crimes is the same thing as committing crimes, you know. And it's the whistleblowers who are less heard of, but in some cases more effectively punished, and now in prison and or having been to prison or having their finances ruined, that intimidate others. So, you know, my advice is get out of the government and become an activist. Don't go into the government with the plan to nudge it in the right direction. But, you know, if you're there, you know, find the courage to become a whistleblower and to get out and to resign in protest, which can be a very effective and a way to engage in activism that they can't go after. You know, when Matthew Ho quit in Afghanistan and said why, that was a very effective piece of activism that didn't involve, you know, so-called classified, so-called intelligence.
I think the key here, and I'm going to try and screen share it, is what you said before, and this beautiful graphic has been made about it. You said we have to resist the temptation to be afraid, because all of the tactics that the government uses is to induce fear in us and to induce fear in the population. It's very Orwellian. I've been rereading 1984, and all of the tactics of oppression in 1984 are about inducing fear in the populace. I randomly tweeted yesterday that either you become complicit in the crimes of the empire, or you become a target of the empire. Personally, I sleep much better at night knowing that I'm a target of the empire than being complicit in the crimes of the empire. And if more of us take that step and speak up and speak truth and speak it loud, it really does inspire others to do it. And what I saw in New Zealand is that when movements achieve critical mass, the ability of the state to suppress them is dramatically diminished. So every person who gets on board with Internet Party or with any social movement, with anti-war activism, increases the safety of everyone who is involved and diminishes the ability of the governments to suppress the dissent. So critical mass really is key. Okay, so in our second anti-spy bill event, we spoke with John Kiriakou, who was the CIA torture whistleblower. And obviously he is a classic case of a whistleblower who was so effective in his messaging and so significant that even the then president had to step up and acknowledge, oh, well, we tortured some folks. What is your take on CIA torture, on how we in the West became the worst of our enemies, you know, in such a short number of years?
You know, torture has a long history in the United States and in Western society, but it was becoming more illicit, more, you know, when I was in a graduate school philosophy program in the 1990s, you know, torture was often used as, you know, the example of something immoral in, you know, theoretical academic discussions. And, you know, it was something that in the United States, the government had to outsource to other countries, you know, had to avoid the appearance of accepting even while engaging in, you know, and since it became, you know, insourced, since it became something that's, you know, widely seen in U.S. news reports about the U.S. government and U.S. entertainment, and you've convinced a huge section of the U.S. public, contrary to all available facts, that it's effective, that it accomplishes something good. So that I just started reading this book about torture in G-rated children's films in the United States. You know, Disney cartoons with characters who are tortured. You know, it's become this normalized. And you have numerous other nations that have clearly expanded the use of torture in response to the U.S. promotion of torture over the past dozen years. And, you know, it's absolutely toxic. I mean, I have a problem with the idea that, you know, we should have our wars without torture, because I don't know of any wars without torture in the history of the world. And once you've sanctioned murder, it's very hard to persuade certain people who haven't bought into that in the right way that torture is a problem. You know, you can murder, but you can't torture. You can murder, but you can't spy. You can murder, but you can't lock someone up without, you know, proper procedures of justice. I mean, it's an argument that's never going to win over everybody. So I want to get rid of war as it was understood at Nuremberg as the basis for torture and all the other ills that it brings with it. But, you know, again, we go through this transfer of power in the United States from an imperial presidency empowered beyond, you know, monarchs and sovereigns of old, and from one party to the other. And you go through this pretense of banning torture as if it had been legal and never prosecuting it. so that it's made into a policy choice rather than a crime. And then you bring back somebody from the other team who openly advocates for more torture rather than just permitting it and pretending to ban it as if it hadn't been banned. This is not how you end torture, And when the courts in Spain tried to prosecute Americans for torture and the US government shut that down through pressure on the Spanish government, that's the problem we're up against. We're up against a system of international justice that's a fraud, an international criminal court that is opposed to crimes by Africans and only by Africans, because of being under the thumb of the permanent members of the Security Council. So we have to treat it as a crime and end it by not permitting it. And of course, if anybody hasn't heard, it doesn't work. There's not some greater good accomplished.
No, it's disgusting. And we've also, as we discussed in that episode, of the CIA torture report, what tiny scraps of it have made it into the public domain, revealed that they were actively recruiting to people with a history of domestic and sexual violence and to perform those roles quite consciously. So this was a very deliberate agenda by the powers that be to engage in this and to involve people who would be the most likely to have a proclivity for it, which is unthinkably despicable conduct, let alone from the system that is supposed to protect us. Okay, so then just my last question for you before Blake comes on is relating to Sean Westmoreland, who is the US drone whistleblower who we had on the show last week. That was probably, that interview that I did with him actually stayed with me for about 4 or 5 days. I was conscious of what I learned and what had been said day and night because of how deeply he was affected by his role, albeit minor in comparison to the size of the team, in the drone program. And I do believe that there is increasing public awareness about how, as we say, counterproductive, the torture is. The drone program is extremely counterproductive. If anything, it is producing terrorism and not reducing terrorism. What can we do and what should we be doing about drone warfare? How do we push back against the automation of mass slaughter and racist wars?
Yeah, Sean and John Kiriakou and others are doing great work as outspoken, ongoing whistleblowers, and rootsaction.org, where I work, is supporting that work of theirs. I think on the one hand, there is steady, slow progress in educating people about what drones are doing. On the other hand, there is steady growth in the use of drones and the deployment of drones and the basing of drones and the proliferation of drones to numerous countries. When you create a new weapon and then you get lots of other countries to use it and get countries that are framed as enemies to use it, then you create more justification for it. I think we have to go after, not just the fully automated drones, as if drones are okay as long as a human being is pushing the button. And I think we have to go after armed bombing, manned personed bombing, the same as unmanned robot bombing. The morality is the same, the strategic effect is the same almost, and the legality is the same. We have to put an end to the idea that there's something acceptable about dropping bombs or sending missiles from ships or any other way onto people's roofs. It's some people I'm working with in the United States are working on developing a large model of what we hope will be a future, monumental size monument in Washington, D.C. to bombing victims. That if you go to victims of U.S. bombing over the years, if you go to davidswanson.org and click where it says list of wars, you'll find a list of the dozens of countries that the U.S. has been bombing with regular airplanes and with drones for decades. And in not a single case will you find, a decent argument to support it as having brought something better to the world. I think, we have to counter, I think, it with drones, a particular myth about the good that they do. The myth that you see in movies like Eye in the Sky that, go along with President Obama's pretense that drones are used where you couldn't arrest people, you had to kill them, and there was no other choice, and they were, criminals, and this is some sort of, justice by execution rather than trial, and they were an imminent threat to the United States of America, which is, of course, not even the case in that fictional military consulted movie. But the reality about what drones do is the same as the reality about what any other sort of bombing does, and it is counterproductive, illegal, and murderous, and we have to make it as unacceptable as any other horrific crime against humanity.
Okay, thank you so much, David. That was just an incredible talk, an incredible opportunity to interview you. Thank you. I'm really, really, really grateful for everything that you've taught me and everyone who's watching. Blake, I'd like to invite you onto the stream. Are you here? And if you could just give David some of the questions that have been asked for him on social media. And David, if you could, sorry to do it to you, but if you could try and keep your answers really short, would be really great, because we are well over time at the moment. Awesome. Hi, Blake.
Hey. So the first question was from Michael Harris. He said, David, what do you think of nuclear testing that's being done in North Korea right now?
Well, I'm against it. That'd be my shortest answer. I also think it's predictable and rational and understandable and not the threat to the world that United States nuclear program is, which is being invested in to the tune of $1 trillion in the coming years, and inspiring a nuclear arms race among several nuclear nations. Yes, we ought to question the enthusiastic reporting of the U.S. media about how advanced the North Korean program is, but more importantly, we ought to understand the history of North Korea's willingness in the 1990s to stop that program and why the aggression of the United States and the United States through South Korea has created that behavior by North Korea. And the United States won't talk peace and disarmament. North Korea won't either.
Right. From Independent Outsider, they asked, is there any way that an anti-interventionist such as Tulsi Gabbard has any chance at all?
Well, I think the real question is whether we have any chance at all when we understand someone like Tulsi Gabbard as being an anti-interventionist, when she's, a selective, limited anti-interventionist, pro-military, pro-war in general. But someone who has introduced excellent legislation and made excellent points and put forth excellent arguments. And when you look at a bill to stop arming terrorists, you would think that the U.S. Congress, spending much of its time trumpeting the danger of the terrorists, would enthusiastically immediately support legislation to stop arming terrorists, and yet it does not. But do we have a chance? Of course, everything always has a chance. We have to do everything we can to work for it, and we have to support bills like that one, and defend someone like Tulsi Gabbard against the attacks of those who oppose that kind of legislation. And they're also opposing rhetoric that candidate Donald Trump put forth about anti-interventionism. But we have a long way to go, and strategically organizing, we can't make it about the person, because the person always has lots of good and lots of bad. We should make it about the policies, and that policy of ceasing to arm terrorists in Syria obviously should have everyone's support, especially as Trump has now claimed he's going to stop doing it anyway. What would be the harm in making it a law?
From Orian McLean asked, does America's actions around the world not reflect the characteristics of the definitions of terrorists? And if so, why do other foreign powers accept this type of behavior from another country? Should they not be ostracized from the global community until they meet certain requirements?
Yes, would be my shortest answer. I think obviously there are financial pressures, political pressures, cultural indoctrination, all sorts of factors in why there's not the sort of resistance to U.S. criminality that there is to criminality by other nations. And part of the problem is an international system, including the United Nations, that is not truly global, that is based on nation state members, with some of those nation states being more equal than others. And reform is needed.
From someone, David, what can be done to investigate government propaganda used in mainstream media?
Well, again, I've written a book called War is a Lie that seeks to catalog the types of it. I think it's always helpful when we have investigations, like a story a few years back in the New York Times that identified, which military experts on CNN and MSNBC and so forth were, without acknowledging it, in the pay of the Pentagon or in the pay of weapons companies, and getting their talking points from the Pentagon and so forth. But the fact that you could identify which were those people, and their comments were indistinguishable from those of any of the other experts permitted on the air, says something about the media in general. I think we have to, there's a nice book. We have to recognize that it's so pervasive. It's not a particular claim by a particular media outlet on a particular day, but it's the entire narrative of Russia the aggressor, or Syria the chemical weapons user. One must use white phosphorus and napalm and cluster bombs, not anthrax. We must use the good weapons, not the bad weapons. Just recognize that it's all pervasive, and needs to be taken on with entirely different conversations, not just challenging particular facts. And it's a big project that requires educating young people as much as, you know, debating particular news readers.
From another one from Independent Outsider. When Trump announced the Saudi military deal with Lockheed Martin, what violations did he commit, if any?
Well, I mean, violations of basic human morality, to be sure. He, of course, was not doing anything that his predecessors in that office hadn't done. We mentioned Hillary Clinton's role earlier. When the U.S. military itself works with Saudi Arabia to kill large numbers of people in Yemen, it's violating not just the Kellogg-Briand Pact and the United Nations Charter, but also a particular U.S. law called the Leahy Law that forbids military cooperation with other countries that engage in human rights abuses. Now, how the hell you commit mass murder without abusing human rights, I don't know, but those are the ways in which the U.S. military is supposed to collaborate with other nations' militaries. But when it comes to selling weapons, this is sacred, holy ground in the United States, and it's generally not illegal until particular laws are passed against particular weapon sales. And this is something that the peace groups in the United Kingdom are going after their government for with regard to Saudi Arabia. And people in the United States are trying to go after the US government for, and there have been efforts in Congress, but much more is needed. And, communicating the fact that it's going on is the important first step.
Another one from Orion or Orion. They spend billions on military, yet get destroyed by commercial cargo ships. They can't win war in Iraq or Syria. So what's the money really going on?
What's the money really going on? I don't know. As Suzie and I were discussing earlier, a huge motivation, one of many motivations for all these wars, is simply profit. And when many of the companies are actually profiting from multiple sides in wars, the goal is clearly not victory or ending the war. I quoted Harry Truman earlier, and I forgot I was also going to quote Israeli officials who in the New York Times in recent months said about Syria, Israel's priority is not for either side to win the war in Syria, but for both sides to be weakened. And of course, that's not just to the strategic advantage of very misguided thinkers in Israel and in Washington, D.C., but it's for the profits of the weapons dealers. Wonderful for the wars to continue. And the Russian government, like the Israeli government, like the U.S. government, is using these wars as showcases for weaponry, which can then be sold on the basis of how it performed in these wars.
Okay, so Suzie, maybe we'll do like one more. From Survivor, what do you consider the relation between the control that Google has on censorship based on the issue James Damore had?
Profess my shameful ignorance and lack of an answer. Google's power of censorship is incredible and incredibly dangerous, and its monopoly needs to be busted, and it needs to be regulated as a utility, and its financial dominance of U.S. so-called think tanks and communication systems needs to be taken on. But you know, the particular case, I don't know.
Okay, so just to jump in there, I think that James Moore is the Google employee who wrote the internal memo, I believe in end of July, an internal memo about Google's diversity policies, and was then sanctioned, censored, and fired, I think, by Google.
Yes, well, my understanding, without having read it, is that it was quite a reasonable and moderate position, with nothing to remotely justify being fired from one's job. But you know, there is a problem with you know, the glorification of companies that do tons of advertising and have tons of presence and depict themselves as, you know, don't do evil, you know, being tolerated in their evil. But there's also a problem in the United States of a lack of a strong labor movement and worker rights in general. And just about everybody in the United States can be fired for no reason whatsoever. And you know, this is a problem that reaches way beyond Google.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Blake, for asking those questions on behalf of everyone, being the voice of the viewers. I really appreciate that. Okay, so quickly now, before we move on to our project here of the anti-spy bill itself, I'm just going to show this was my very dog-eared copy of David Swanson's War is a Lie that I was just showing you guys before. This is what it looks like. You'll see the quote from Daniel Ellsberg on the cover, that this is a terrific tool for recognizing and resisting war lies before it is too late. There is a number of luminaries in activism and whistleblowing who have written opinions about their reviews of this book inside, which are well worth reading. The other thing I wanted to quickly show you is another one of my prized possessions, which is When the World Outlawed War. This is the book that David was talking about a bit earlier on when he was discussing the 1928 Kellogg-Briand Pact. This is the book that he wrote about that pact, and that shows us that there is in fact a historical precedent for these types of anti-war legislation being introduced, especially in the international arena. So this is not, I mean, there's a famous video somewhere of I don't know who he was. He was now he was in his 90s when he was speaking in the video. I believe it was alongside like John Bolton actually being interviewed about the establishment of the United Nations. And he, from memory, began quoting the founding charter of the United Nations, the reason for it existing, being formed and existing. And I had chills down my spine watching him talk about it, because he's literally saying, you know, in the memory, you know, it's the lest we forget thing. It's like, in the memory of all those whose lives have been ravaged by war, we will come together with the principal purpose of ending war. And that was precisely why the United Nations originally formed, was to be an organization that would prevent war. Not just that would regulate war, but that had the fundamental aim of ending war. And it seems that somewhere along the way that's gotten lost. It's become corrupted and it's been subverted. And sure enough, we now live in a world that has more war than ever before. The other thing I wanted to show you guys is Tube World. This is the amazing children's book that I was talking about earlier on the stream. It is just the coolest thing you ever read. So if you have kids, I strongly recommend that you get a copy of this book. It will teach your children things about places all over the world that they might just never know about otherwise. And it's very relevant to the issues that we face in the current times. Okay, so I'm feeling a bit lonely here. Does some of our awesome candidate team who's sitting in the Zoom want to jump on with me and say hi? So earlier this week, we announced our party list had been accepted by the Electoral Commission, and we did a stream introducing all of our candidates for 2017. So if you go to our YouTube channel and check that out, then you can actually see each of our candidates talking about why they joined the Internet Party is, what their area of interests are, what policies they're working on, and what this campaign means to them. And also a little bit about the future and where we're going with our movement building beyond 2017. Okay, so I'm hyper conscious of the fact that we now only have a short time left on the stream before we have to cut it off, because I know it gets a bit late for everyone. So this week I was sent a pretty amazing resource from Transparency International, I believe, which outlined, actually, you guys, I think you have the link, if you can put it out on social media for people to look at. It's the one that Jordan was reviewing today that I had posted about. So it was a link to existing legislation from all around the world and regulation and international law that relates to some of the issues that our anti-spy bill is trying to confront. So this is something we need to examine really, really closely, because we need to reference it from within the anti-spy bill itself. So Joe, do you want to screen share for me, or I can pass you host, if you want to screen share for me the Etherpad where it's at right now, and let's get that link added into it. And social media team, can you guys please put out the link to the Etherpad to everyone so they can jump in as well and have a look? So last week we introed this Etherpad concept, which is like a kind of like a collaborative document space where anyone who's watching, as well as anyone from Internet Party, can add their 2 cents into the draft of the anti-spy bill. And last week we recapped the principles that we are trying to address in the bill. We recapped the specific pieces of existing legislation in New Zealand that we are wanting to counteract with this bill. And we introduced the framework for how the bill will be laid out. So today I would like to add in some of the reference material and to have a look at what's been done over the last week. Joe, can you screen share without me passing you host?
I certainly can.
Awesome.
I will share very shortly. Bear with me. So here we go. There is the current draft of our chaos pad, which is accessible through policy.ipnz.live for those of you who aren't already here. And for those of you on Facebook, I believe you need to see that screen. There you go. So this is...
eyes, please, because it's unreadable on my screen.
Yeah, totally.
Zoom in. Would be great. A bit more.
More.
Make it big for us all.
Make it big. All right. Here we go.
Cool. Fantastic. So now I will just jump out of Zoom and jump into the Etherpad myself.
I want to turn off the chat.
Cool. So you guys that want to join us in this endeavor, jump onto the Etherpad and then add your first name to the top where it says, please add your name on the right. And you'll see also that there is the chat function, and you can actually have conversations with people or make notes about what you're adding or editing within the pad. So who wants to be in charge of adding some stuff? Someone, I deeply appreciate your anonymous messages of love and support that you send every week. Thank you. It makes me blush, to be honest, but thank you very much. Let's add in a references section, maybe down here, somewhere before the bill format.
Just let us know which line number you're at, in case I need to scroll
I am at
through.
line number 92 presently.
Right down there. Cool.
NGO positions. Existing international law. Okay, references section to review and incorporate where appropriate. So if one of my awesome team want to come along and add in those links, that would be really fantastic.
Hopefully someone's got it. Yeah, so unnamed, if you want, yeah, just in this side panel here, you can click on the people, and when that'll pop out all the people, and you can give yourself a name. I've just given yourself a name. So yes, the intent was that you would see this little arrow and click on here, but certainly, yeah, adding it at the top helps as well. Awesome.
Cool. So we already have some of the New Zealand positions, for example, the Law Society and the Human Rights Commission. We already added those in last week. So what we will do here in the international references section is add in published positions from NGOs on related issues. And also, gosh, you guys crack me up with your messages. Also, into existing international law. So has someone tracked down that link? The link was, I'll give a little shout out. The link was actually sent to us by someone at Expose Facts. Expose Facts is a organization that represents and advocates for whistleblowers, as well as other activists and technologists around the world. You can visit them at exposefacts.org. It was Privacy International, not Transparency International, my bad. So just insert that under NGO positions, please.
Sure can.
Thank you. Cool. Now, do you want to open up that link and let's have a little look through it together? I think it's really key. This is where we can see the historical precedents for the anti-spy bill.
Excuse me.
Cool. Scroll down, let's see a menu or contents. Wow.
We're keeping up.
Okay, scroll down. We don't need to read it. I just want to show people what's in it.
Yeah, there's all sorts of
Cool.
gems in here. And the recommended way to go through this is just by going Control F and finding what you're after, a topic of interest. But there's something about everything, you name it, safeguards, distinctions, debates, and more. So, yeah.
Cool. Okay, just step us back up to the first page of the content section, please.
Yep, here we go.
So this looks like it will become the Bible for referencing the validity of the positions that we're trying to take. And this is something that I was aware of from the beginning of this endeavor, is that all of these abuses that we're trying to outlaw actually many of them are supposed to be outlawed by existing international treaties and also the New Zealand Bill of Rights. But the pieces of legislation that we referenced that have been introduced in New Zealand have been systematically stripping away those protections from us. So that is why it is so important to counter it with the anti-spy bill, because we need to reverse that stripping away of our human rights and our civil liberties. So what this document is doing is showing us that there are precedents in international law for all of these protections, that there are provisions in place to prohibit agencies from engaging in abusive tactics and techniques. So what do we have here? We've got the right to privacy in international and regional treaties. Fantastic. Principles surrounding surveillance and the right to privacy. Legality, principles of legality, necessity, proportionality, adequate safeguards, that there should be reasonable suspicion and effective oversight. Data retention, transparency requirements, safeguards, distinctions. Interesting, distinctions and safeguards between law enforcement and intelligence agencies. That is particularly interesting because we have seen like the homogenization of the data that is gathered by the spies. It is filtering down in this great big waterfall from the international intelligence agencies to the national intelligence agencies to the police agencies. But as I've written about it before, it is actually a two-way waterfall, because the information is sucked up from the police agencies into the intelligence agencies, and then a portion of information collected by the international and national intelligence agencies does flow down to the police agencies. And one of the things that, when I was going through being heavily targeted as an activist, one of the things that I used to constantly wonder to myself is like, where are the men in black, the quintessential men in black, the Mr. Smith from the Matrix movies? Like, the CIA doesn't like roll up, you know, a bunch of black suits on your doorstep. What I realized over time and with a lot of study is that the CIA doesn't need to have men in black running around the place, because the CIA ingests all of the intelligence information from all of the police and intelligence agencies in the world. So that police officer that comes and knocks on your door and then goes and writes a report about it is effectively providing intelligence to the CIA, because the data that is collected and stored in the police databases is accessible by the intelligence agencies. So actually the entire security state is accessible to agencies like the CIA. They don't need to target you specifically with agents. Every agent of the state is effectively a CIA agent, which is a strange and scary thought, but it's very true. This is the way that they operate. This is what the fusion centers that you hear us talk about, this is what they were all about, and what they were designed to do was to link all of the police and intelligence databases and information, and to share that information between agencies. But even more scarily, to share that information to the private sector. So last week we talked about critical infrastructure in these pieces of legislation. They reference critical infrastructure as including banks and including, you know, certain private corporations and for-profit corporations. And they're the big data companies that you hear about that are collecting the information from the private sector are also being connected by companies like Palantir, Peter Thiel's Palantir, which operates in New Zealand. They are combining the police and military intelligence databases with the big data private databases. And then this almost universal pool of information is available at the top tiers to agencies like the CIA. So defining or having distinction, that's a much better word, the distinction and the safeguards between law enforcement and intelligence agencies is extremely important, because that is precisely the principle that is under attack by the GCSB bill and the many other pieces of subsequent legislation. And what else have we got here? Chapter 3A, surveillance and other human rights provisions. Jurisdictional clauses, extraterritorial application. So this is where the extraterritorial meaning, for example, the Kim.com case is a classic example of extraterritorial overreach, where an agency in the United States wanted to get Kim.com, and so how did they do it? They did it by going through the New Zealand agencies and flying down to New Zealand in their big black helicopters and, you know, participating in raiding his house. But it is that overreach is where one state or one nation's intelligence services are reaching out onto the territory of another country to impose their own will and their own domestic agenda. Mass surveillance programs, which we know is happening in New Zealand, and that's why they retroactively legalized it. We know it's happening around the world. Debates surrounding surveillance-related capabilities. The debate over encryption. So this looks like this document is going to be relevant both to the anti-spy bill and to the digital bill of human rights that we are wanting to develop in the wake of the anti-spy bill. In the digital bill of human rights, we are going to address issues like the human encryption as a human right. Debates surrounding, where are we? Over hacking and vulnerability exploitation, which is a very, very pertinent to the CIA Vault 7 releases. The right to privacy and the roles of responsibility of MNCs. What is MNCs? Can someone find that out for me, please? Multinational corporations, I'm guessing. Am I right? Is MNC multinational corporation?
I imagine there's an index somewhere that'll tell us. It does talk about corporations.
That's what MNC normally means.
Okay. I haven't come across it before, but that intuitively I assume that MNC is multinational corporation.
Yes, that's correct.
Cool, thank you.
It's not defined anywhere else in the document. So yes, let's assume.
Okay, so I guess that what we need to do is we need to pull apart this, the reference material, and apply it to the specific provisions that it relates to in our bill.
Mm.
And then what's at the end there? Was that the last part, chapter 6A? What are the additional...
There's a bunch of principles, additional quotes and things. I'm still sharing it, aren't I? Yep.
Yep, you are. It's cool. I'm looking. Okay, jump down to number 3, please. Chapter 3.
Surveillance and other human rights provisions.
Right, okay, cool. Let's have a look at the list of sources at 140 to 146.
Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Rights and Duties of Men, Covenants on the Child. Yep, so yes, Convention on Cybercrime. So there's a fair few international legal references here.
So that's international, but it's also territorial. So if you just scroll back up a little bit. See, this is the theme. Yeah, great. Just leave it on there for a second. So this is the same theme that we see in New Zealand, where we are a signatory to international laws and covenants that do provide protections against the types of abuses that people are facing on the ground in New Zealand. And then we also have the Bill of Rights Act, which additionally should provide protections to us. But in practice, either those are completely ignored by the agencies involved, or the lack of oversight means that they have no reason really to abide by them. They don't see any reason to abide by them because they don't see any recourse being taken against them when they commit these violations. And then we have the government attempting to create new legislation, an endless stream of it, to legislate away those human rights and civil liberties that we have. So what we see in this source list here is that, yes, it's a matter of international law, the Declaration of Human Rights, these are UN things, International Covenant on the ICCPR, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Again, that's a United Nations Charter. But we see the American Declaration on the Rights and Duties of Man. We see a European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights. I think when a bit further down there was like the Arab Charter on Human Rights. So there are like provincial or territorial covenants that are also supposed to provide protections. It's not just a matter of international law. So I think this ties back in a little bit to what David Swanson was saying about ICC, like the criminal court. And he was saying basically that although the international law is supposed to protect us, the enforcement mechanisms have been corrupted. And that means that we can't count on international law to protect us anymore. So I think that while international law is really important and the maintenance and development of it is really important, and we shouldn't forget that it exists, I think that this is actually verifying that initiatives like the anti-spy bill are extremely important, because we have to tackle these things locally. We are not going to be saved by the UN, even if the UN puts out a statement saying that these agencies shouldn't be doing this, ratifying that the activists should be protected. It essentially is toothless at this stage. So we need to tackle this in terms of New Zealand law in order to gain protection for New Zealanders. Now, most of those pieces of legislation I am aware of. There is one there that is very interesting to me, and that is the one around personal data. Convention for the Protection of Individuals with regard to automatic processing of personal data. I would very much like to read through that. That would be fascinating. Very fascinating too that it's from 1981. Because you can imagine that the automatic processing of personal data in 1981 would be vastly different to the automatic processing of personal data in 2017. Okay, fantastic. So then let's make a little task list in our Etherpad. And one task is to cut up the references and information in this link into the specific principles of the anti-spy bill that it relates to. If you want to jump back into the Etherpad, Joe, please, that would be great. So we want to find the references that apply to the specific principles of the anti-spy bill. Awesome. Do we have any commentary from viewers about what we're doing here, or any questions from you guys? Now would be, we've got about 11 minutes left, so now would be the time to ask. If you have any questions for me, or any questions for the party, or any questions relating to anti-spy bill. I see Blake has been smiling away to himself for the last few minutes, so I assume there's some entertaining things happening on social media.
I was smiling at something else, to be honest, but I'm just waiting for their comments because there's a delay in the YouTube.
Fair enough. Okay, so once we have the appropriate references for each of the principles, which ratify that those principles should already be respected and are already covered under international law and case law, then we can begin to draft the actual provisions themselves. So then the other task that needs to be done is, if you scroll up to the top of the Etherpad, Joe, somewhere close to the top where we list the existing pieces of legislation that we're concerned about, is that we need to isolate, and this should be added to the task list, we need to isolate the specific clauses within each of those bills and acts that we want to amend. So when we talked through last week what the structure of the bill would be, we talked about the fact that we would do amendments to existing legislation, and then that we would introduce the new principles. So in order to do the amendments, we need to isolate the specific pieces of text that are problematic. So we know what the definition of those are. We've discussed that, why it's a problem and which parts of it are a problem. But what we need to do is to isolate the precise wording that needs to be changed. And when you look at amendments to existing legislation, when the government decides it wants to amend something, it literally isolates the text that it wants to amend and then strikes it through. So we will follow the same methodology, and that is to isolate the specific pieces of text that we want amended in the existing bills, strike them through, and then supply replacement wording to them.
You have some fans here, Suzie. They're asking when Kiwi in Moscow 3 is coming out.
Well, actually really soon. So Ksenia, who's my co-host on Kiwi in Moscow, she was away. She was actually in Tbilisi in Georgia was it Azerbaijan or Armenia, one of them, having the time of her life. She's recently gotten back, and we are planning to film an episode really soon. Realistically, because I suck at video editing, it takes me about 2 to 3 weeks to actually get the episode put together and put out. I'm really bad at it. If there's someone who can do a much better job than I do in crappy iMovie making the episodes, that wants to help me with that, maybe it will happen a little bit faster. But it's the end
Puts hand up, maybe.
What's that?
Puts hand up, maybe.
Blake, if you want to become an unpaid producer on Kiwi in Moscow, I'm totally down with that, because honestly, we basically film it in a day or 2 days, but then it takes me 2 or 3 weeks to produce an episode. But yes, we will. We've already planned out where we want to go and what we want to do, so we'll go ahead and do that. It was my birthday last week, about a week ago. And Ksenia had just got back, and she conned me into going out to a Russian karaoke bar that had only English language songs. And I never drink. I'm actually not a drinker at all. However, she did get me to partake a little bit on that night, which is very unusual for me. And the next thing I knew, I found myself with her arms wrapped around me, singing Bohemian Rhapsody at the top of my lungs, on film. She actually filmed the whole thing. So look at Nick's like, oh my God, what did you do, Suzie? What did you do? So there is, in fact, in existence, this very lengthy video of Ksenia and I swaying in this karaoke bar singing Bohemian Rhapsody, replete with headbanging, I must admit, in the guitar solo. So we will probably cut.
It's definitely a song to headbang.
We will probably cut about 25 seconds of the most acceptable parts of that song, of our rendition of that song, into Kiwi in Moscow as well. So there's a little spoiler for you. But it is the end.
Nick's got his head in his hands.
What's that? Shame, I know.
Nick's got his... Yeah.
Shame. It was hilarious. I would like to say, I got up on stage, and I won't be releasing this one, but I got up on stage and I sang Better Be Home Soon by Crowded House. That was my very emotional Kiwi moment for the night. And in my terribly disjointed Russian, started the song by trying to explain to people that this is a New Zealand song and I'm from New Zealand. It's very significant. And then at the end, I got off the stage and I said to Ksenia, wasn't my Russian awesome? Couldn't you understand my Russian? And she said, oh, no, sorry, we actually couldn't understand any of it. She's like, you speak so slowly, like syllable by syllable, that it's impossible to understand what you're saying. So I was like, oh, crap. I will learn one day, I promise. One day I'm going to somehow master the language, but it might just take me 30 years at this rate.
You know, it's quite similar to Better Be Home Soon as The Drugs Don't Work by The Verve. So.
How is that similar?
Someone should do a mashup of those two songs. It'd be quite good.
Oh, the acoustic guitar. Now I get you. The acoustic guitar riff.
The whole song is pretty much, yeah.
All right, back to work, people.
Back to the legislation, which is nothing to do with Queen or Crowded House. Unless is there questions, Blake?
There was one, but I'm a bit confused.
You can leave the troll comments out. Unless there's something really pressingly urgent I need to address, like why my drawers are open on my dresser, or like some of the
It's a common question. It has been asked a few times.
I'll tell you why my drawers are open on my dresser. Is because the like runners or whatever that they're on like are old and got stuck, and I didn't know how to fix them. I have not yet worked out how to correct them so that they shut properly. So basically it's a reflection of my own ineptitude at carpentry is the answer to why my drawers are partially open, rather than like some wish to expose my clothing to the world.
Do they come out?
Come out. Yeah, they go.
Live on Andy Spybill tonight, fixing Susie's carpentry issues, live from New Zealand, all the way to Moscow. Yes.
God, you wouldn't believe it. Like, I did that piano piece. I recorded the piece of me playing the REM song for J for me. And I get comments. I actually got an email. Someone emailed me and said, you need to raise your wrists higher off the piano keyboard when you're playing. This is the time it amazes me that I put this comment.
That's the beauty of performing live.
My
live
teacher
audience.
Of course,
used to tell me,
they would realize that I was sitting on like a toddler's chair, because it was the only chair I had to sit on at the piano. So the reason my wrists are like this is because they're like my arms are like above my body as I'm trying to play this song. Oh God!
Teacher used to tell me the wood is poison.
Oh really? I think people overthink. I think some of the content that I produce. Maybe we could stay a little bit more issue focused rather than like my wrists or my bedroom drawers.
It's just a treat for the viewers who are still watching after this time.
Well, they should have learned by now that
scoop.
You should have learned by now that the best part of the stream is always the end.
When we're all losing it a bit.
When we're all at
We're overtired and overtaxed and still somehow fighting for you all.
Indeed.
Okay. Onwards and forwards. Is there any questions about the anti-spy bill, or the principles involved, or the issues we're raising, or the initiative as a whole?
No, safe to say.
Okay, so the next thing is that we want to wrap up this anti-spy bill initiative as soon as possible. For two reasons. One, we want to have a complete version of it to go and pitch to all the NGOs and ask for support from people like HRC and Law Society, etc. And two, because we want to move on to involving the international community in developing the Digital Bill of Rights that Kim and I spoke about in the episode before last. So what we will probably do is we will start doing stream sessions during the week, just short ones, where we're working further on the development of the legislation. So maybe like Tuesdays and Thursdays, we can do a half-hour stream a night, and we can start to flesh it out more and more and more. Actually, I feel like we're a lot closer than it looks, because bringing all the pieces of information together is actually the hard part. It's like when I write an article, like it can take me 2 weeks to put together my like 80, 90 source links and really process what it is that I'm wanting to say. And then the actual writing itself comes in like 1 or 2 days. I'm talking about my monolithic 7,000 word, 90 source link articles that I have a penchant for masochistically writing every now and then. I feel like this bill is the same. Like we take all these elements, we put them together, bring all the information together, all the links together, and then the actual writing itself will be a relatively quick process. Then we are obligated to put it back through our membership. So you will see the bill being submitted to the Lumio and us asking the members to ratify it. And then once it has been ratified by the membership, the adoption of the bill will become an official policy of the Internet Party going forward, even beyond this election. And we will pitch the bill to all of the NGOs who we would like to write letters of support and to participate in pushing for the adoption of this bill. So I'd just like to recap. I've mentioned before that we've seen again this week in the leaders' debates in New Zealand, which I was unsurprisingly excluded from, the Labour Party saying yes to the adoption of medical marijuana, the legalisation, decriminalisation of medical marijuana. They said they had a simple answer and the answer was yes. Well, in 2014, the answer wasn't yes. The answer was, oh, you crazy potheads. So basically,
it's great to see the Internet Party influencing mainstream politics. Yeah.
So while in 2017 the current narrative is no one cares about spying, no one cares about anti-spy bill, which is like their petrified like denial, because actually most of our country cares about spying, as was proven by the GCSB movement. Most of our country cares about the issues that we're discussing. It's just the media has created a barrier between us and access to the general population, because they don't want the general population knowing the work that we're doing on these issues. So they're saying now this is ridiculous. You know, how can they be crowdsourcing legislation? How can they be doing these things? Why is this their focus in the election? Don't be surprised in 2020 when you hear, we must stop the spies. We must do something about this. Like, let's create an anti-spy bill, because this is the ongoing cycle that we see over and over again. Is that, I mean, there's a very famous quote: at first you're ignored, and then you're ridiculed, and then they fight you, and then you win. And that's exactly what we've seen with the medical marijuana issue. It was ignored, and then it was abjectly ridiculed. Abjectly ridiculed. It was portrayed by the media to be a source of ideological divide within Internet Mana in 2014. They actually said that the topic was so controversial that it could tear the party apart. And in 2017, the answer from the Labour Party is yes, yes. So if we can move that far in 3 years on that issue, we can definitely move that far in 3 years, the next 3 years, on spying and criminalising those who are undertaking criminal activity on behalf of the state, but who have been getting away with it and trying to cover themselves by creating.
How about tertiary education? Same thing happened there too, didn't it?
You are spot on. You are spot on. It was considered anathema that we could reintroduce free tertiary education. And now you have the Labour Party justifying how it can be done. So you are 100% spot on. It's very, very, very fascinating to watch for me, is the narratives that are put forward by the media and the way something can be ridiculed and then something can be celebrated, depending upon whether that narrative now becomes convenient to the powers that be, and which includes the media and the government and the international and foreign military partners of New Zealand. So I expect to continue seeing that trend with a lot of, even the live streams, you know, like when we first announced, we were the first party saying we're going to live stream our campaign. We are going to put it all on the internet. And next thing you know, I think every
next
party...
minute, Labour's doing it, National's doing it. Everyone's doing it.
They're all live streaming. I mean, it's funny because we had the same thing happen with the media in New Zealand. In 2011, one of our candidates, actually, Ben Cooney, was the live streamer for Occupy Auckland, and no one in our country was live streaming. The media weren't live streaming anything. The government wasn't live streaming anything. It was unheard of. And we were told openly by media, this will never fly. Like, the public will never be interested in live streaming. Like, they want produced content. They don't want live content. And look how wrong, they've been proven. Now, all of the media are live streaming their events. So they rail against progress. They rail against change. They rail against doing things differently. Anyone who does things differently is a heretic in their eyes. I remember a member of the mainstream media telling me that my articles could never be considered journalism because I embedded tweets in them and I embedded social media content in them. And that this is what they told me, honest to God. They said to me it was not journalism because I was incorporating multimedia and social media into my articles, and that a real article is text only with no source links, 300 to 600 words, and that if I wasn't producing media content like that, I would never be a journalist. That was what they told me to my face in 2011. And now, hello, any single mainstream media outlet that you look at has tweets embedded in their articles, has photos embedded in their articles, is having to put source links in their articles, and it's become standard practice. The reason it's become standard practice is because we did it and it was popular as hell. We were getting 800 shares on Occupy Savvy articles, 1,000 shares on Occupy Savvy articles, at a time when the New Zealand Herald was lucky if they got 30 shares on one of their articles. And so whenever they see that we do something differently and there's uptake of that idea, then they co-opt it as their own. And next thing you know, you will have journalism lecturers in New Zealand teaching journalism students, you need to embed a tweet in your article. You need to put source links in your article. And this is how we go. We go from you're not a journalist to we will take your techniques and use them ourselves to we will teach journalism students to replicate your techniques. It's amusing to see the full cycle. So that's where we're at with the anti-spy bill stuff. Now, that link that we just gave you to that document is accessible all week long, 24/7. So you can go and add thoughts or information, and this would be an extremely helpful thing for you guys to do for us.
Whoa, welcome along, Bruce.
Sorry, muting you, Bruce. If you find relevant links or information to any of the principles that are in the bill, or if you find historical precedents in international law or regional law around the world, go to the link and add, go to the Etherpad and throw the link in there, and we'll look at it and review it. Or if you want to review the pieces of legislation that are already linked in there and isolate those like relevant subsections or and quote the text and drop that into the Etherpad, that's a huge help for us as well. So as we mentioned, we actually have two Etherpads. This is the Chaos Pad because it's the public version. And then we have the version that will finally be adopted, which is the protected version. So we are insulating ourselves from any issue of vandalism of our pad. I believe also that there's version control and everything's tracked as well. So
one of the coolest features of this pad, if it'll do it for me, is if you've ever seen it, just rewind and play back. It's pretty cool. If you click on the two arrows, you can just rewind the entire thing back to when we started this thing. But yes, my computer tells me that I can't stream 6 different pages and
oh my god, look,
play some
bombing our presentation. Dude, give me a heart attack.
Who's in there?
MrKim.com has
Joining
joined
us. Awesome.
Kim, where you at?
Joining us from his sick bed.
Yeah, literally.
It's awesome to see you here, Kim.
Wow, that's
Anyway.
so cool.
Yeah, he's been watching us the whole time. We all know this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Kim, can you hear me? Are you going to jump on video?
Oh, he is on video.
Where
It's
is
just
he?
he's
Somewhere
in
in
his bedroom, dark,
Oh.
joining us, and so we can all send him get well thoughts. Yeah.
Yeah, so Kim has been sick last week and this week. But I did
Yeah,
send
guys, I'm here. I'm sorry. I'm really sick, so I couldn't really participate.
you have literally faded to black.
No, it's all
Yeah.
good.
No, I just wanted to let you know, guys, that I was watching the whole thing, and it was, again, absolutely amazing, but I couldn't participate. I'm just coughing the whole time.
I hope you're being looked after. Is your beautiful lady bringing you treats and looking after you?
Yeah, medication. That's right.
Oh my God. Well, thank you so much for soldiering on and coming and saying hi to us.
Yeah, don't
really
think that I'm ignoring you or something. It's just I'm really not feeling well. Okay.
Oh, look at you.
Yep, the comments on YouTube are all telling you to get well soon.
Oh,
All right, guys. I will mute myself, and I'm watching. Okay.
Yeah.
Please get better soon, because the entire world is waiting for the awesome stuff that you have up your sleeve.
All right, guys. Thank you.
Excellent.
Good show again. Really well done, Suzie.
Oh,
Cheers.
Thank you so much. It's been amazing, really amazing experience. I feel really lucky. I mean, these people that we're bringing on these events, these are people whose work I have followed for years, whose books I have read, whose speeches I have listened to, who I have looked up to, because they are really freaking brave people. And they are all people who are fully qualified to go into the corporate sector and make millions of dollars serving the empire. And instead, they've done the opposite. They have stepped out of the machine, and they've spoken out against the machine. They're raging against the machine, literally. And that is just so admirable from where I'm sitting. Sorry, I don't mean literally from where I'm sitting, but ideologically from where I'm sitting. I am so impressed by people who take personal risk for the benefit of everyone. And as we see the world literally collapsing around us, people are talking about Texas, obviously, about Houston, but 3 continents this week had massive flooding. 3 continents. In Nigeria, I believe, and was it Uganda or Nigeria? In Africa, they had massive flooding. In Asia, they had massive flooding. And in the United States, they had massive flooding. We are just facing the biggest issues. It's like this, what is it? The 7 horsemen of the apocalypse are all riding right now, like famine and war and just all of them. And we are all we have left, ourselves, people who are willing to band together and speak the truth, the unprofitable truth about what is happening and take the risks. And I think if there's somewhere, for me to sign off, a note for me to sign off on tonight, it would be what I was saying earlier, which is that every single person who joins us increases the safety of everyone that in the group. So not just Internet Party, but in the worldwide activist network, the whistleblower networks, every single person who stands up and acts and speaks out is making it more difficult for the system to control us and to oppress us and to suppress us. You are insulating everyone. They can go after one person, they can go after 10 people, they can go after 100 people, they cannot go after 100 million people. So you are helping to make the snowball bigger, and you are helping to protect us all and to give us a hope, to give our kids and our grandkids a hope. So thank you from the bottom of my heart for ignoring the bullshit that the media feeds you. And thank you from the bottom of my heart for understanding that these issues are not to be cared about for 6 months in an election cycle so you can get votes. These are issues that we will still face next year and the year after. And thank you for your cute messages telling me you love me, which definitely do make my day, I must admit, on our Etherpad. Thank you to all of our amazing candidates, to our panelists, to our guests. Thank you to Kim for, stepping up and standing by me, quite frankly, and putting me in the position where I'm able to speak my truth to you guys, and I'm able to serve you to the maximum ability that I can serve you. So thank you to everyone who thinks twice and who speaks loud and who reads and studies this material and circulates this material. If you want to make a spy or a billionaire have a really bad day, go to the Internet Party and donate to this campaign. Go to WikiLeaks and donate to WikiLeaks. Go to couragefound.org and donate to Courage Found. Go to worldbeyondwar.org. Go to exposefacts.org. Go to rootsaction.org. Get involved. Get involved. That's all I got to say. Thank you guys so much. Next week, we're going to have even more spectacular guests, and we're going to do this all again. So see you next Sunday. Much love from the Internet Party, and thank you for listening.